Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It had been a long day. I was running on fumes by the time I pulled into my driveway. Work had dragged on, and I'd stayed late to finish up some reports. I was exhausted, barely thinking straight, just going through the motions. The neighborhood was quiet, most of the houses dark except for a few porch lights. It was late past midnight, but I had done this routine 100 times before. Get out of the car, grab my bag, walk up to the door, unlock it, and step inside. Except the second I did, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled different. Not bad, just not mine. It was subtle, something like cleaning supplies mixed with a faint trace of food I didn't recognize. I took another step inside, my brain still trying to catch up with what felt off. The furniture was wrong. My couch should have been against the left wall, but instead, there was a small wooden table covered in mail. The TV was in the wrong place. The rug was missing. I stopped breathing. This wasn't my house. I turned, my hand already reaching for the door handle, but before I could move, I heard it. A sharp click. I froze. The sound had come from deeper inside the house. A mechanical, deliberate sound. A gun being cocked. Then a voice. Don't move. The tone was steady, cold, not panicked. Whoever it was, they weren't scared. I raised my hands slowly, my whole body locking up. My mouth was dry. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say. My voice cracked. I swallowed and tried again. I made a mistake. I thought this was my house. I swear to God, I lived 2 doors down. Please. Nothing. I couldn't see him yet. He was in the hallway, hidden in the shadows. I could hear his breathing, slow, steady. He was thinking. I forced myself to stay still. Any sudden movement could get me killed. Then, footsteps. Slow and measured, coming closer. He stepped into the light. He was older, maybe mid-50s, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was gray at the temples, his face lined but hard. His hands were steady as he aimed the gun at me. A pistol. Looked like a .45. His eyes locked onto mine. You're lying. My stomach dropped. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. No, I swear to you, this is a mistake. My house is 2 doors down. Same model, same layout. I was on autopilot, I wasn't thinking. His grip on the gun didn't waver. You didn't break in? No. I have my key. I lifted my right hand slightly, still holding the keys I'd used to open the door. He glanced at them, then back at me. That's not my key. My breath hitched. I looked down. He was right. My house key was still in my hand, untouched. The door had been unlocked. I hadn't even needed to use my key. He saw the realization hit me. Door was open, he said. His voice was unreadable. You just let yourself in. I nodded quickly. Yes. And that's my mistake. But I didn't mean any harm. Please. He took a slow step forward. You sure about that? My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I swear, I whispered. He stared at me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then he moved fast. He reached forward and grabbed my wrist, yanking it up to check my keys. His grip was like iron, fingers digging into my skin. He turned my carrying over, checking the address tag attached to it. Then, finally, something shifted in his face. He believed me. His grip loosened, but he didn't lower the gun. "You're an idiot," he muttered. I let out a shaky breath. "I know." For a second, neither of us moved. Then, he jerked his head toward the door. "Get the hell out of my house." I didn't need to be told twice. I moved slowly, keeping my hands visible, not turning my back on him. I reached for the doorknob, twisted it, and stepped outside. The second I was on the porch, I exhaled so hard my legs nearly gave out. Behind me, the door slammed shut. I stood there in the cold night air, my whole body shaking, my heart still hammering. I could still feel the pressure of his grip on my wrist. I looked down at my keys, my mind struggling to process how I had been so careless. I turned my head slightly, looking 2 houses down. My house. My actual house. Porch light on, front door closed. I had been one mistake away from getting shot in someone else's home. I never walked into my house on autopilot again. I was just trying to grab a few things before heading home. It was late, probably close to 1 in the morning, and I was exhausted. Work had run long, and I hadn't eaten since lunch, so I pulled into the first convenience store I saw. It was one of those small, independently owned places, dimly lit parking lot, faded signage, a single flickering light above the entrance. There were only 2 cars outside, one parked near the side of the building, the other closer to the entrance. I didn't see anyone inside through the glass doors, but I didn't think much of it. The bell jingled when I stepped in. The air smelled like stale coffee and cleaning supplies. The place was mostly quiet, just the soft hum of the fridge units in the back and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I went down the first aisle, grabbed a bottle of water, then moved toward the snack section. Everything felt normal at first, but after a minute, I realized something was off. It was too quiet. I hadn't heard anyone moving. No rustling, no footsteps. There was no cashier at the counter, no other customers walking around. The store wasn't big, and with how silent it was, I should have been able to hear someone. I looked around. The shelves were stocked, the registers were open, the store lights were on, but it felt empty. I walked toward the counter, expecting to see an employee come out from the back or something. There was no one there. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The register was right in front of me, the small counter cluttered with cigarette cartons and scratch-off tickets. Behind it, there was a door leading to the back room. It was wide open. I hesitated. The door shouldn't have been open like that. Convenience stores don't just leave their stockroom unlocked and unattended. And the way it was open, it wasn't just cracked. It was wide open, swinging slightly like it had been pushed and left that way. I felt my stomach tighten. I leaned over the counter, trying to see inside. The back room was dark. I couldn't see much beyond the doorway. Something about it made my skin crawl. I glanced around the store again, hoping to see anyone. Still nothing. Just rows of untouched shelves, the buzzing lights, the hum of the coolers. I took out my phone and checked the time. 1:12 a.m. I thought about leaving. I should have. But something about the open door, the eerie quiet, the abandoned register, it made me uneasy. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I stepped around the counter. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to confirm that no one was there, that I wasn't imagining how weird it felt. Maybe I wanted to convince myself everything was fine. The second I stepped closer to the back room, I felt it. Something was wrong. The air back there was different, colder, heavier. The smell changed, too. It wasn't strong, just a faint metallic scent mixed with something stale. I stopped just before the doorway. I couldn't see anything inside, just darkness. The store lights didn't reach all the way in. I stood there, waiting, listening. And then, a sound. A rustling, like something shifting in the dark. I felt my pulse hammer in my chest. I backed up slowly, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned on my heel and walked fast toward the door. Not running, but not normal either. Every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, to get out before I saw something I didn't want to see. As I reached the entrance, I heard something from behind the counter. A creak, a soft scrape against the floor. I didn't look back. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the cold night air, my hands shaking. I walked straight to my car and locked the doors the second I got in. I sat there for a second, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. Then I looked up. The other car in the lot, the one parked near the side of the building. There was someone inside. A figure, sitting in the driver's seat. They weren't moving. They weren't looking at their phone, weren't adjusting anything, weren't even pretending to be doing something. They were just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I turned my car on, my heart pounding. I didn't even bother buckling my seatbelt. I just backed out of the lot as fast as I could and pulled onto the main road. As I drove past, I glanced at the other car one last time. The figure inside turned its head. Just slightly. Just enough to let me know they had been watching me the whole time. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I had been driving for hours that night, picking up whoever needed a ride. It was late, close to 2 in the morning, and I was thinking about heading home when another request came in. The pickup was just a few blocks away, and the destination wasn't far, so I accepted it. The profile name was just a first initial, J. No picture. That wasn't uncommon, so I didn't think much of it. I pulled up to the location, a stretch of road with no houses, just an empty parking lot and a streetlight flickering overhead. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then, from the shadows near the edge of the lot, a figure stepped forward. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, hands shoved into his hoodie pocket. He didn't look at me right away, just walked up to the passenger side and got in without a word. I glanced at him in the mirror as I pulled away. His face was thin, pale, and his eyes looked wrong, not tired, not high, just empty. I made myself focus on the road. Some people didn't like to talk, and that was fine with me. A few minutes passed in silence. The only sound was the tires against the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Does anyone know you're working this late?" His voice was quiet, flat. I felt a chill run through me. I kept my eyes on the road. Yeah, I lied. I check in with my wife every hour. I wasn't married. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he let out a short, dry laugh. Smart. I gripped the wheel a little tighter. Another minute passed. Then he spoke again. you live alone?" I forced a casual tone. "Nah, got family waiting on me." "Another lie." He nodded, like he was thinking about that. Then, softly, he asked, "Does anyone know where I am right now?" I swallowed hard. My pulse was speeding up, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sure the app tracks the ride." Silence. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. He was staring at me. Not at his phone, not out the window. Just at me. Something shifted in his face, something slow and deliberate, like he was deciding something. And then, just as I was about to ask him if everything was okay, he leaned forward slightly. "I think I gave you the wrong address." His voice was calm, almost apologetic. My stomach dropped. "Where do you need to go?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then held it up. "Here." I glanced at the map. The new location was farther out, past the city limits, near a patch of woods. I didn't react, just nodded and kept driving. But my mind was racing. I checked the gas. Half a tank. Enough to get out of there if I had to. A minute passed. Then another. The road ahead was empty. No cars, no houses. Just darkness. I needed a plan. "I gotta stop for gas," I said suddenly, pointing to a station up ahead. "Won't take long." He didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged. "All right." I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and shut off the engine. For a second, I considered running inside, telling the clerk to call the cops. But then I saw the knife. It was just a glimpse, the way his hoodie shifted when he reached into his pocket. But it was there. Small, sharp. He hadn't pulled it out. Not yet. I forced myself to move normally, stepping out of the car. I went to the pump, pretended to swipe my card, then leaned into the open driver's side window. "Hey, can you grab my wallet from the glove box?" The second he looked away, I reached in and hit the unlock button for the back doors. Then I turned, heading toward the station entrance. I kept my pace steady. Not too fast. Not too slow. I reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The clerk barely looked up. A kid, maybe 19. I walked straight to the counter, lowering my voice. "Call the police. Right now." His eyes widened. "What?" I didn't get a chance to say more. Behind me, the bell above the door jingled. I turned. The man was standing in the doorway. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he smiled. Not big, not exaggerated. Just enough to let me know he had figured it out. He took a step inside. I backed up. The clerk, finally realizing something was wrong, reached for his phone. The man stopped, glanced at him, then back at me. He tilted his head, almost curious. Then, just as slowly as he had entered, he turned around and walked out. I ran to the door, watched as he climbed into the driver's seat of my car. The engine roared to life. I barely had time to react before he peeled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. I never saw him again. I found the couch on a classified site. It was listed under the free section, which meant it would probably be gone fast. The pictures made it look decent, gray fabric, a little worn but nothing bad. The post just said, moving, need it gone ASAP. First come, first served. There was a phone number and an address on the other side of town. I texted the number. The reply came almost instantly. It's still available. Can you pick it up today? I told them I could be there in an hour. No response, but that wasn't too weird. People giving away free stuff usually didn't want much back and forth. The place was a small, rundown house in a quiet neighborhood. The lawn was overgrown, and there were no lights on inside. The couch was already outside, sitting near the curb like they had just pushed it out the front door. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I waited a minute, knocked again. Nothing. The whole street was empty. No kids playing, no cars driving by. Just quiet. I sent a quick text here to pick up the couch. No response. I stood there for a second, feeling weird about it, but the couch looked fine. If they didn't want to talk, that was their problem. I walked back to my truck, pulled it up closer, and started lifting one end. It was heavier than I expected. I had to reposition my grip a couple of times before I could slide it into the truck bed. As I strapped it down, I kept glancing at the house, waiting for someone to step out. No one did. The drive home was quick. I pulled into my driveway, backed the truck up, and started dragging the couch inside. I was setting it against the wall in my living room when I heard something duct tape peeling. I stopped. I crouched down, lifted the front edge of the couch, and looked underneath. There was something stuck to the frame. A small, black rectangle about the size of a pack of gum. Wires ran from it, attached to a tiny battery pack. I grabbed it and pulled hard. The duct tape stretched, then ripped free. I turned it over in my hand. It was a GPS tracker. My chest tightened. I had seen enough of these online to recognize it. They were cheap, easy to buy, the kind people use to track cars. Someone had taped a tracker to the bottom of this couch. I stood up fast and locked my front door. My mind was racing. Had it been there before I picked it up? Had I just carried this thing into my house, not knowing someone was tracking it? I checked my phone. Still no response from the number I had texted earlier. I tried calling it. The line rang once. Then the call ended. Not a voicemail. Not a rejection. Just ended. I tried again. This time, the number was disconnected. My mouth went dry. I looked at the tracker in my hand. If it was active, someone knew exactly where I was right now. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street was empty. My truck was still in the driveway. Everything looked normal. I checked the time, almost 9 p.m. The sky was getting dark. I grabbed my keys. I wasn't keeping this thing in my house. I needed to get rid of it. I walked out to my truck, opened the tailgate, and tossed the tracker inside. Then I got in, started the engine, and pulled out. I drove across town, trying to think. What if it wasn't meant for me? What if someone had put it there for the previous owner? But if that was the case, why list the couch for free? Why ghost me after I took it? I turned onto the highway, speeding up. I needed to put some distance between me and the tracker. I drove until I reached a strip mall parking lot. I pulled into a space, grabbed the tracker from the truck bed, and looked around. No one else was nearby. I pried open the battery cover and yanked the power source out. Then I tossed the whole thing into a dumpster behind the grocery store. I stood there for a second, listening. Nothing. Just a distant hum of cars on the main road. I got back in my truck and drove home. When I pulled into my driveway, everything looked the same. My house was dark except for the porch light. No strange cars, no people waiting. I locked the doors behind me and sat on the couch, the same couch. I stared at it. I didn't sleep that night. I went to the store late that night because I didn't want to deal with crowds. I was tired, wearing sweatpants and an old hoodie, just trying to grab a few things and go home. The place was quiet, mostly empty, just a few people here and there. At first, I didn't notice him. I was in the produce section, picking out some apples, when I saw someone in my peripheral vision. A man, standing a few feet away, not looking at anything in particular. Just standing there. He wasn't doing anything weird, just holding a basket, staring off. I moved to another section. A few minutes later, I was in the dairy aisle, grabbing a carton of milk. I turned, and there he was again. A little closer this time. Still not looking at anything, not picking anything up. Just standing, holding his basket, like he was waiting for something. My stomach felt tight. I told myself it was nothing. Just some guy shopping. But something felt wrong. I moved to another aisle. A minute later, I looked over my shoulder. He was there. Every aisle I went to, he followed. Always a few feet away, never looking at the shelves, never putting anything in his basket. Just standing there. Watching. I felt my pulse pick up. I tested it. I went to the snack aisle, pretending to look at something, then suddenly turned and walked straight to the frozen section. 30 seconds later, he walked in. He wasn't even pretending to shop anymore. His basket was empty. He wasn't reading labels, wasn't comparing prices. He was just there. I gripped the shopping cart tight. My heart was hammering now. I needed to get out of there. I left the cart behind and walked straight to the checkout. I didn't care about the groceries anymore. I just wanted to leave. The cashier rang up my few items. I kept glancing toward the aisles, waiting to see if he followed me. He didn't. I started to feel stupid. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was overreacting. Then I stepped outside. And there he was. Standing near my car. He was pretending to be on his phone, head tilted down, thumb scrolling over the screen. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't walking to a car, wasn't waiting for a ride. He was just standing there. I stopped just outside the doors, pretending to check my receipt while I tried to think. He knew which car was mine. I had barely noticed him in the store, but he had been watching me the entire time. Long enough to know which cart I was pushing. Long enough to see me walk toward the exit. I felt my hands start to shake. I didn't want to go to my car. If I walked to it, he could follow. He could wait until I unlocked it, until I was close enough, and then... I turned on my heel and walked back into the store. The automatic doors slid open, and the cashier looked at me, confused. "You forget something?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just waiting on a ride," I said. She nodded, uninterested, and went back to scanning groceries. I peeked out the window. He was still there. Still pretending to scroll on his phone, still standing in the exact same spot. I felt my stomach drop. I pulled out my phone and texted my friend. "Are you awake? I need you to call me." The three dots popped up immediately. What's wrong? Just call me. Now. A second later, my phone rang. I answered on the first ring, keeping my eyes on the man outside. Hey, I said, keeping my voice casual, loud enough that the cashier could hear. Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, I'll wait inside. No, I don't want to walk out alone. The man shifted. I kept talking, even though my friend hadn't said anything yet. Yeah, I see your car. I'll come out when you pull up. The man started walking. Not fast, not running, just turning away, heading toward the back of the parking lot. I watched him go, my whole body tense. He wasn't parked close. He wasn't parked in the normal section at all. He walked past the cars, past the streetlights, toward the darker area where the cameras probably didn't reach. I didn't move until he was completely gone. When my friend actually pulled up, I ran straight to her car. I never saw him again. It started out as a normal camping trip. I had planned it for a while, needing some time to get away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just a couple of days to clear my head. I found a spot in the woods, a bit off the beaten path, but not too far out. The kind of place where you could pitch a tent, make a fire, and be alone with your thoughts. The first night was fine. I set up camp, cooked a simple dinner, and sat by the fire for a while, just listening to the sounds of the woods. I had a small flashlight, a lantern, and a book, but I ended up just staring into the fire. The night was peaceful, and the sky was clear. I was relaxed, ready for a quiet sleep. But then, around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. My eyes opened, and for a moment, I didn't know why. I wasn't sure if I had just shifted in my sleep or if something had woken me. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No bugs buzzing, no wind rustling the trees. Just an eerie silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around my tent. I didn't move, but my heart started racing. It was the kind of silence that made every sound sharper, more noticeable. I tried to listen, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from or how many steps there were. They stopped, then started again. Someone was pacing around my tent. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe someone else camping nearby. But the footsteps didn't sound like they were caused by an animal. They were too rhythmic, too heavy for an animal. And the way they circled the tent, it didn't feel right. I stayed as still as possible, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? But what if it wasn't someone I could reason with? What if it was worse? The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity. Around my tent, stopping occasionally, then starting again. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Then, they just stopped. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. I listened, waiting for any sound, anything to break the tension. But there was nothing. I reached for my flashlight, which was within arm's reach, but my hand froze. I wanted to move, to check, to find out who was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if they saw me move? What if it wasn't a person at all, but something else entirely? The fear that gripped me was like nothing I had felt before. I wasn't scared of wild animals. I knew how to handle that. But this was different. I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was waiting for me to make a move. I stayed completely still, listening to my own heartbeat, trying to make out any sound. The footsteps didn't come back, but the silence pressed down harder. I don't know how long I lay there, just waiting, but eventually, I fell back asleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was rising, and everything looked normal. Birds were chirping, the wind was light, and the camp was quiet again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The unease that had gripped me last night hadn't gone away. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, nothing out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I'd just been too tired. But then I saw the footprints. They were right outside my tent. At first, I thought it might have been my own footsteps from when I had gotten up earlier, but the tracks were too clear. They were too deliberate. Someone had circled my tent, walking in a perfect circle around it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking slowly, deliberately, and the ground was soft enough that the indentations were clear. But there was no one around. I looked around, my mind racing. I could see no sign of anyone else. The forest was empty. There was no sign of a campfire, no smoke in the air, no evidence of other people nearby. I walked around the perimeter of my camp, trying to make sense of it. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there when I went to sleep, but they were unmistakable. They weren't animal tracks either, no claws, no paws, just a clear shape of shoes. I kept walking, my mind trying to process everything. The tracks led off into the woods, but they didn't continue in any particular direction. It was like whoever had made them had just stopped and disappeared. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. There was no explanation for it. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I didn't want to admit how scared I was. I told myself it was just some drunk person wandering through the woods, or maybe someone who had been camping near me. But the tracks didn't add up. They circled my tent. Why would someone do that? I didn't sleep much that night. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, too afraid to go too far from my campsite. I kept hearing things in the woods around me, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but whenever I looked, I saw nothing. The whole night passed in silence, broken only by the occasional sound of something moving just beyond the trees. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't even finish breakfast. I didn't want to stay any longer. I had no idea what had happened the night before, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I loaded my things into the car and drove off as fast as I could. I haven't been camping since. Every time I think about it, I remember those prints. The way they circled my tent, the way the silence felt heavier when I was alone. I still don't know who was out there, or why they did it. But I can't forget the feeling that someone was waiting for me. I was staying at a hotel for work, just an overnight stop before I could make it to the next city. Nothing special, just a regular hotel off the highway. The room was fine, clean, and a typical budget place with all the standard amenities. It was a little noisy from traffic, but nothing I couldn't ignore. I got in late and had a long day, so I went straight to bed. Around 3 a.m., I was woken up by the shrill sound of the fire alarm blaring. It was one of those high-pitched alarms that makes you jump out of your skin. I sat up in bed, disoriented at first, trying to make sense of what was going on. The flashing red light from the alarm added to the confusion, making everything feel surreal. My first instinct was to get out of bed, gather my things, and leave the room. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, ready to call the front desk and ask what was happening. but as I reached for it, the alarm suddenly stopped. I froze. It was silent again. I looked at my phone, nothing unusual, no messages, no missed calls. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of sleep. Maybe it was a false alarm, but it had been so loud, so sudden. I decided to play it safe. I grabbed my bag, checked my shoes, and opened the door to the hallway. The moment I stepped out, a weird feeling washed over me. The hallway was completely silent. The fire alarm had stopped, but there was no movement. No sound of people rushing to the exits, no doors opening. I figured maybe everyone was still asleep, but it struck me as strange. This was a hotel with lots of rooms. People usually start moving when the alarm goes off. I looked both ways down the hallway. The lights were on, but the place was empty. I stood there for a second, trying to decide what to do. My first thought was to go down to the lobby and check. If there was a real fire or an emergency, I wanted to know. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the hallway. It didn't make sense. I walked down the hallway, the silence pressing down on me. My footsteps were the only sound. I stopped at the elevator, but then decided against it. It seemed strange that no one else was up, not even the other guests in the building. I dialed the front desk. "Hello, this is the front desk," a calm voice answered. "Hi, I'm in room 217, I said. My voice was shaking, and I couldn't quite control it. I heard the fire alarm go off. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice came back, slow and deliberate. "There hasn't been any alarm triggered here, ma'am. I've checked the system. Everything's fine." I frowned. But I heard it. It was loud, and it woke me up. She sounded like she was looking at something, probably a computer screen. "I assure you, there hasn't been any alarm. Maybe it was a mistake. We haven't had any issues tonight." I was confused. If the alarm hadn't been triggered, then what had I heard? And why was the hallway so empty? "Are you sure?" "Because I was just in the hallway, and it's completely quiet." "No one's here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Again, the long pause. Then, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but no one else has reported any issues. You're the only one calling." I didn't know what to say. There was something about her voice too calm, almost like she wasn't surprised at all. No urgency in her tone, like it wasn't a big deal. "Okay, well, thanks," I said, still not sure what to think. I hung up. I stood in the middle of the hallway for a few moments, my heart still racing, still unsure of what I should do. I started walking back toward my room, the quiet feeling even more suffocating now. The silence felt off, unnatural. As I passed the other rooms, I tried to listen. Nothing. No noise, no sounds of anyone stirring. There should have been people coming out of their rooms, checking the halls, but it was like I was the only person there. When I got back to my door, I hesitated. I didn't want to go back in, but at the same time, I didn't know what else to do. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I stared at the ceiling, trying to calm my nerves. I tried to convince myself it had been a glitch, just a false alarm. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the silence, the emptiness. I checked my phone again, hoping for some explanation. Maybe an email from the hotel or a message. Nothing. I turned the light off and lay back in bed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to that strange emptiness in the hallway. Why hadn't anyone else reacted? Why had no one else even stepped into the hallway? After what felt like hours, I heard the faintest noise. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. A knock. I froze. It came from the door. I got up slowly, heart hammering, and walked over. I didn't open it, not even a crack. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I stood there for a long time, listening for anything. But there was nothing. I didn't open the door. Instead, I pushed a chair against it and crawled back into bed, trying to force myself to sleep. I didn't leave the room until I checked out the next morning. The hotel staff didn't mention anything unusual, and there was no explanation for what happened. No one mentioned any alarms, no reports, no notes. Just like the night before never happened. But I haven't stayed at a hotel since. I haven't trusted the quiet. It was a Thursday afternoon when I got home from work. The usual routine: dropped my bag on the couch, kicked off my shoes, checked the fridge for something quick to eat. But then I saw it. A package. It was sitting on my doorstep. Plain cardboard, no label, no return address. Just there. I didn't even notice it at first. It blended in with the rest of the clutter: advertisements, a letter from my credit card company, and some junk mail. But this was different. I didn't order anything, and no one had told me I was expecting a package. I thought about leaving it there. Something about it felt wrong, but I figured it was just some random delivery, maybe a mistake, maybe from a friend who forgot to tell me. Maybe one of those online purchases my brother made on my account without saying anything. But I picked it up anyway, curious. I brought it inside and set it down on the kitchen counter. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and light, almost too light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the day had been rougher than I realized. I opened it. The first thing I saw was a stack of photos, printed on thick paper. They were of me, taken from inside my own house. The first one was of me sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee in the morning. I didn't even remember the moment, but there I was, caught on camera, completely unaware. My mind raced. How could someone have taken this photo? I flipped through the stack. There were more. A photo of me in my living room, watching TV, the light from the screen reflecting on my face. Another one of me sitting on the couch, with a book in my hand, looking down, completely oblivious. Each photo was taken from different angles, different times of day. I didn't know if I should feel angry or terrified. The photos were too clear. Too real. I could see the details, the exact furniture, the curtains, the spots on the carpet. But none of it made sense. None of it added up. The last photo stopped me cold. It was a shot of me in my own bedroom, taken through the window. I was in bed, asleep, the covers pulled up to my chin. The blinds were halfway open, and the window was slightly cracked, something I never did. It wasn't like I had a perfect view of the street from that angle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside my house, watching me. The room felt suffocating, the silence in my apartment too thick. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I went from confused to terrified in an instant. Who was doing this? Why me? I scanned the photos again, my hands shaking. There was no note, no explanation, nothing else in the box. Just those photos. I had to do something. I called my best friend, Mark. He picked up on the second ring. Dude, what's up? His voice was relaxed, like nothing was wrong. Mark, something's going on. I need you to come over. I could barely get the words out. What happened? I paused, trying to figure out how to explain it. I got a package. No return address. And inside, there are photos of me. In my house. I don't know how the hell they got them. But someone's been taking pictures of me. There was a long pause. Are you serious? I could hear the disbelief in his voice. Yeah. I don't know what to do. I feel like someone's been in my house. I'm freaking out, man. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Stay inside, lock up, and don't touch anything. Yeah, okay. I hung up, still holding the photos in my hand, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I paced around the apartment for what felt like forever, my mind running in circles. My phone buzzed, Mark texting me. He was on his way. The next few minutes felt like hours. I checked the locks on all the windows, then the door. Every noise outside the apartment made me jump. The idea that someone was watching me, knowing what I was doing, terrified me. When Mark finally arrived, he didn't waste any time. He knocked once, then immediately started checking the apartment, looking at the windows, the doors. Are you sure you didn't leave a door or a window open? He asked, scanning the place. I don't think so. I don't remember doing it, but I trailed off, trying not to sound panicked. I never leave anything unlocked. I'm always careful about that. Mark looked at the photos in my hands. Who the hell would do something like this? He flipped through them quickly, his brow furrowed. Do you recognize any of these? I shook my head. No. It's just me in all of them. He gave a quick nod, then set the photos down on the table. We need to call the police. Already did, I said, showing him my phone. But I don't know if they'll be able to do anything. There's no evidence, no signs of forced entry. Mark didn't argue. He just stared at the photos for a moment longer. Let's try to think this through. Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to do this? I shook my head again. No, nothing like that. I mean, no one I can think of. I don't know, Mark. This doesn't make any sense. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Mark kept looking around the room, checking windows, walking back and forth. I could tell he was getting nervous too, but he was trying to keep it together. The doorbell rang. I froze. Mark motioned for me to stay quiet. He went to the door, checked the peephole, then turned back to me. It's the cops, he said, his voice tight. I opened the door slowly. 2 officers stood there, their faces serious. They asked to come inside and immediately began looking around the apartment. Do you have any idea who might have sent these? One of the officers asked. I told them everything I could. The photos, the package, the feeling of being watched. They asked if there had been any other unusual incidents, any threats or strange people around. I told them no. They took the photos with them, told me they'd look into it, but they couldn't promise anything. They made me feel like I was being paranoid, like maybe it was all some misunderstanding, even though the unease still hung thick in the air. Later that night, after the officers left, I sat in the living room, my eyes constantly flicking to the windows, to the door. I kept checking the locks over and over again, waiting for some sign that this was all just a mistake. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone had been watching me, taking those photos. And I had no idea why. The police never called back. They didn't find anything. but I never went back to that apartment. I moved out the next month, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling of being watched since. The thought that someone, somewhere, knows more about me than I know about them haunts me. I had just finished a long shift at work, and I was exhausted. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I got on the train to head home. Normally, the ride would be quiet, a few people here and there, but nothing too bad. I always sat near the middle of the car, near the doors, with my headphones in and my book out. It was my routine. That night, though, there was something different. The train wasn't crowded, which was typical for that hour, but there were only a handful of people left on board. I noticed a man sitting across from me when I first got on. He looked to be in his mid-30s, maybe a little older, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He didn't seem out of place, just another tired commuter. I tried to ignore him and focused on my book, but I kept feeling his eyes on me. It wasn't constant, just every few seconds I'd look up and catch him glancing over. It wasn't aggressive, but it made my skin prickle. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking it. I kept my eyes down, pretending to read, but the feeling didn't go away. Every time I looked up, he was still watching me, and I swear he hadn't moved at all. The train made its usual stops, but more and more people got off. I wasn't paying close attention to the station names, but I noticed the car starting to empty out. The last few passengers got off, leaving just me and this man. I was trying to calm myself down, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just waiting for his stop, too. But it was strange. The train was nearly empty now, the car silent except for the quiet rumble of the tracks and the occasional click of the train doors. The man still hadn't gotten up. I couldn't concentrate on my book anymore. I felt like I had to keep looking up at him. Each time I did, he'd be looking at me, his eyes just slightly narrowed, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual tired glance of someone else on a late-night train. It felt more deliberate. I decided I needed to act normal, so I grabbed my phone, pretending to check my messages, trying to ignore him. But when I looked up again, I realized something: he hadn't moved. At all. The train had already passed a few more stops, and we were getting closer to the final destination. Still, he hadn't budged. I told myself again that I was being paranoid. Maybe he was waiting for the same stop, maybe he was tired, maybe it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the train slowed down for another station, I glanced at the map on the wall. The next stop was the last one. When the train reached the final stop, everyone else had gotten off, and I was the only one left in the car. I could feel my heartbeat picking up. It was quiet now. Too quiet. I grabbed my bag, ready to get off, but when I moved toward the door, he didn't. He was still sitting there, staring at me. He hadn't gotten up. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I should say something or just get off the train. I wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but I felt like I couldn't leave until he did something. I felt trapped. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage, and started walking towards the door again. Before I could reach it, he spoke. "Are you getting off?" His voice was low, almost casual, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped. I didn't turn around, but I could feel his eyes on my back. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm getting off." I reached for the door handle, but something made me pause. I had this horrible feeling that he was watching me, waiting for me to leave first. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. He was still sitting there, staring at me. There was something unsettling about his stillness. He wasn't making any move to get up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me very carefully, like he was waiting for me to do something. My hand was still on the door, but I didn't open it. I looked at him again, waiting for him to stand, waiting for some sign that he was getting off too. But he didn't move. He just kept staring at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped back quickly, heart racing. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I couldn't. I opened the door and stepped out onto the platform. The station was completely empty, the lights flickering overhead. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs to the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silent station. I didn't look over my shoulder until I reached the street. I was shaking. I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through me, my hands trembling. I don't know why I didn't call the police or tell someone, but something about it didn't feel like it was worth reporting. It felt like I had imagined it all, like it was just some odd encounter. But every time I think about it, I remember his eyes, those eyes that never left me. It was a long drive. I had been on the road for hours, the kind of drive where you just go and go, your mind numb, the highway stretching out ahead of you with no end in sight. The landscape had changed from cities to open fields, and then, just before the sun started setting, I found myself in a part of the country where there wasn't much around. No other cars on the road, no buildings, just the occasional sign for miles. I had noticed the gas station a while back. It sat alone off the highway, lit by the flickering lights of old street lamps, surrounded by nothing but trees and empty fields. I wasn't running low on gas, but I knew I'd need to stop soon. There weren't any other stations for miles, and I'd rather not risk it. I pulled into the lot. The place was old, the kind of gas station that probably hadn't seen any serious updates in decades. The pumps were rusty, and the building itself looked like it had been built in the 60s and hadn't been touched since. A single attendant stood outside, leaning against the door, watching me as I parked. I noticed right away that the guy looked off. He was wearing an old, faded uniform, and his face was pale. He seemed young, maybe in his mid-20s, but he looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. When I got out of the car, he straightened up and walked over to me. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said. "Fill it up, please." He nodded, but there was something about the way he looked at me that set me on edge. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. His eyes kept darting toward the building behind him, like he was watching something out of the corner of his eye. I went to open the gas cap, and that's when I saw it, his eyes. They weren't focused on me at all anymore. He was staring past me, over my shoulder, toward the trees at the edge of the lot. It was so strange. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking over my shoulder, and his face went pale. I turned around, expecting to see something, maybe another car, maybe a person, but there was nothing. Just empty road and darkness. When I turned back to him, his expression changed. His eyes weren't just focused on the trees anymore. They were wide, almost panicked, and he was shaking his head slowly. Then, without taking his eyes off me, he subtly mouthed something. It wasn't loud, but I could see his lips clearly. "Don't turn around." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I had heard him right. I felt a sudden chill crawl down my spine. Why was he saying that? What was he trying to warn me about? For a second, I didn't know what to do. Should I just get in the car and leave? Should I ask him what was going on? I stood there for a moment, frozen, and that's when I saw the movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the trees. It was quick, just a flash of movement between the shadows. At first, I thought it was a deer or some animal, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. I felt my pulse quicken. I didn't want to turn around. I wasn't sure if I should, but everything in my gut told me to get out of there. Fast. I turned back to the attendant, and he looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and desperation. He was still standing there, holding the nozzle to my gas tank, but his attention wasn't on me anymore. It was on whatever was behind me. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just shook his head again, more violently this time. He was visibly trembling. His hands were shaking as he held the nozzle. I didn't want to ask him what was wrong. I just wanted to get in my car and leave, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. I glanced over at the lot again, but nothing was there. Just the trees, swaying lightly in the wind. But I knew I couldn't stay any longer. "Is everything okay?" I asked again, my voice shaking slightly now. He finally looked at me, and when he did, I could see that he was terrified. "You need to leave," he said in a hushed voice, barely above a whisper. "Now. Don't ask any questions. Just go." I stepped back, trying to act like everything was fine, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to run to my car, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should even trust him. He looked back at the building behind him, then quickly glanced at the trees again. His face was pale, his breath shaky. "Please," he said, this time louder, almost pleading. "You need to get out of here. Don't turn around." I didn't think twice. I turned around and ran toward my car, my heart racing. I didn't stop to look at the trees or the attendant. I didn't care anymore. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I turned the ignition, throwing the car into reverse. I backed out of the lot quickly, looking over my shoulder at the attendant as I did. He was standing near the door to the building now, watching me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I didn't stop to ask him anything. I didn't want to know what he had seen or what was out there. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding. The attendant there looked at me with concern as I filled up, but I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know what he saw, or why he told me not to turn around, but I can't shake the feeling that something was following me, something I wasn't meant to see. And I've never stopped at a rural gas station that late at night since. I had just moved into a new house, a rental, and everything about it seemed perfect at first. It was a quiet neighborhood, nice and peaceful, not too far from work. The house itself was older, but it had character. The kind of charm that makes you overlook its creaks and slight drafts. I figured I'd make it my home, just for a year or so while I settled into the city. One thing that caught my attention, though, was the basement. The landlord mentioned it briefly during the tour. "Lots of storage down there," she said. "It's a bit of a mess, but it'll work for what you need." When I moved in, I decided to take a look. The basement was like the rest of the house, old, a little musty, but fine. It had a washer and dryer, some boxes piled up, and a few shelves. Nothing out of the ordinary. But there was one thing that stood out, this locked door at the back. I remember pausing when I first saw it. It was a simple wooden door, no windows, just a brass handle with a heavy lock on it. It didn't look like a normal part of the basement. There was no reason for it to be there. I figured it was just a closet, maybe where the old owners kept things, and since I didn't need any extra space, I didn't think much more about it. But I kept coming back to it. I don't know why. It just felt odd. Like something was behind it that didn't belong. I brought it up to the landlord a few days later, thinking she might explain it. She was nice, friendly enough. She told me not to worry about it. It's just an old storage closet, she said with a quick smile. It's been there forever. Nothing in there you'd need. I didn't push it. It seemed like a strange thing to obsess over. But there was something about that door. Every time I went down to the basement, I could feel my eyes drawn to it. I couldn't help but wonder what was behind it. A couple of weeks went by. I started getting comfortable in the house, settling into the routine. Most of my things were unpacked, and I spent my evenings reading or watching TV. The basement became a place to toss my laundry or store old boxes, but I avoided the locked door. I didn't even touch the lock. I didn't want to pry. Then, one night, everything changed. It was around midnight when I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to pull me from sleep. I lay there in the dark, trying to ignore it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses do that. But then it happened again. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Something moving. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a creak in the walls, it was something else. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I looked at the clock, 12:23 a.m. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from the basement. I could hear it clearly now, scraping, like something shifting across the floor. I froze. My mind raced. The door in the basement. That locked door. It was almost as if the sound was coming from behind it. I had to know. I couldn't stay in bed, not knowing what it was. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and quietly made my way downstairs. I had to walk past the kitchen to reach the basement door, and as I did, I could hear the sound again. It was unmistakable now, something was moving down there. My heart was thumping in my chest, each step heavier than the last. I turned on the basement light and stood there in front of the door, the lock staring back at me. I could feel my palms sweating. My breath was shallow. For a moment, I thought about calling the landlord, but then I remembered her brushing it off. Nothing in there you'd need, she had said. She would probably think I was overreacting. I swallowed my fear and turned the lock. The door opened with a slight creak. The light from the basement filled the hallway, and I hesitated before stepping inside. There was nothing unusual at first glance. The shelves were still filled with boxes, and the washer and dryer hummed quietly in the corner. But then I noticed something different. A pile of what looked like old clothes, ruffled up, like someone had moved them recently. My breath caught. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I stood frozen for a second, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then, I heard it again. The sound soft, but distinct, coming from the far side of the basement, near the wall where the door was. I couldn't see anything in the shadows. It was getting closer. Something was definitely moving. I had no idea what to do. I should have left, should have run out of there and locked the door. But instead, I stepped forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I moved closer to the wall, the sound stopped. I stopped too. My eyes were glued to the spot where the noise had come from. Everything felt wrong. It was too quiet. Too still. Then, my flashlight beam caught something. A pair of boots. They were hidden behind a stack of old boxes, facing the wall. A person was crouching there, hidden in the shadows. I froze. The air around me felt thick. My stomach dropped. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the boots, my mind racing. Should I say something? Should I run? Should I scream? But before I could even decide what to do, the person stood up. Slowly, as if they had all the time in the world, their face still hidden in the shadows. And then they stepped forward. I didn't wait to find out what was going to happen. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I ran up the stairs faster than I ever had in my life. My heart was pounding, and my feet barely touched the steps. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and locked it without thinking. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't know who they were, or why they had been hiding down there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying in that house another night. I packed my things the next morning. I called the landlord, told her I was moving out, and left the house without even looking back. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in that basement. I never told anyone about it, but I haven't been able to forget the boots. It was late, around 1:30 a.m. I had been at a friend's place for too long, catching up over drinks, and now I was driving home on an empty highway. The road stretched out in front of me, lit only by my headlights and the occasional street lamp. It was the kind of drive where you just let your mind wander. I wasn't speeding. I know I wasn't. There was no reason for it. But then, I saw the lights behind me. At first, I thought it was another car coming up too fast. But no, the lights were flashing. Red and blue. Not just a regular headlight, but unmistakable emergency lights. I glanced at my rearview mirror. The car wasn't moving fast, it wasn't tailgating, but the lights were still there, flashing. I checked my speed. No reason to panic, but I pulled over. I wasn't nervous at first. I've been pulled over before. I knew the drill: turn off the engine, keep my hands visible, wait for the officer to come up to the window. But this felt different. It wasn't the usual marked patrol car. This one was an unmarked sedan, black, with no visible markings except for those lights. No police logo, no department name, nothing. The car stopped behind mine, just a little too far back. I felt a slight unease crawl up my spine. The officer's door opened slowly. He stepped out, and right away, I noticed something off. For one, he wasn't wearing a badge. I tried to dismiss the thought at first. Maybe it was just hidden by his uniform, but no. There was no badge anywhere. Just a plain shirt, dark pants, and a utility belt. Nothing that screamed police officer. The uniform was even odd. It didn't look like the usual dark blue or tan. It was just off. Not quite right. He approached my car. I rolled down the window, trying to stay calm. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice low but clear. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" I looked up at him, trying to get a read on his face. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a cap that shaded his eyes just enough that I couldn't get a good look at them. His features were sharp, but there was something unsettling about his expression. Too calm. Too neutral. I felt like I was talking to a mannequin rather than a person. "No, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not sure. Was I speeding?" He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking at me. I could hear the slight hum of the engine, the low buzz of the streetlights above. Everything felt unnervingly quiet. "No," he said finally. "But you seem a little disoriented. Just wanted to check." Disoriented? That was a strange word to use. I didn't feel disoriented. I had only been driving for about 20 minutes, and the road was straight and clear. But the officer didn't seem to be in any hurry. He just stood there for another second, staring at me, like he was waiting for something. I was starting to feel uneasy now. I don't know why. Something about his presence was off. He wasn't acting like a normal officer. I couldn't place it, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Can I see your license and registration?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, reached into the glove compartment, and handed him my documents. He didn't take them immediately. Instead, he glanced down at them, his fingers hovering over the papers but not quite touching them. I noticed his hands were shaking just slightly, but he tried to hide it by adjusting his grip. "I'll be right back," he said after a long pause. He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was racing now. There was no reason for a cop to pull me over at this hour, and the way this guy was acting felt wrong. He wasn't like any officer I had ever seen. I could still see him standing at the back of his car, talking to himself quietly. Maybe he was on the radio. Maybe he was just going to check my info. I didn't know, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I waited for what felt like forever. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, but it felt longer. He didn't come back. I checked the time. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I glanced around. The road was still empty. There weren't any other cars coming, no other signs of life. Everything was still. Too still. I started the engine, planning to drive off slowly, just to get out of there, but then I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly rolled down my window. The officer was back. But this time, something was different. He didn't have my papers. He was empty-handed. He stood at the window, looking down at me with that same unsettling calm. "You don't need to leave," he said, his voice soft. "I'm just making sure you're safe." I felt my throat tighten. Safe from what? I asked, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. His lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It didn't look like anything. Just a slight shift, like he was trying to hide something. "You'll be fine. Just need to make sure you're okay." I didn't like how he said that. Something about it felt off. Like he wasn't talking to me like a normal officer would. Like I was a subject in some kind of experiment. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of there. I didn't look back, didn't wait for him to react. The tires screeched as I sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest, until I finally reached a more populated area a few miles down. I didn't stop. I didn't pull over again until I reached a well-lit 24-hour gas station, where I felt safe enough to breathe again. I looked in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the unmarked car following me, but there was nothing. Just the quiet road behind me. I don't know who that man was. I don't know if he was an officer or someone pretending to be one. I don't know what he wanted, or why he made me feel so terrified without doing anything overt. I just know that I didn't stay on that road any longer. I took another route home and locked every door in my house the second I got there. I've never driven that way again. I live on the third floor of an apartment complex. It's one of those older buildings, the kind where the walls creak and the elevators are a little too slow, but it's quiet, and I don't mind it. I've been here for a couple of years now, and I'm pretty comfortable with the routine. The apartment faces the back of the building, so I don't get much noise from the street. My balcony overlooks a small alley with a few dumpsters and some trees. It's not the most scenic view, but it's peaceful. I woke up one morning, about a month ago, to something odd. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was still early, but the sun had just started to filter through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. I stretched, groggy, and glanced over at the clock. It was just after 7 a.m. I wasn't in a rush, so I decided to take a minute to enjoy the quiet. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to start my coffee. As I passed the window, I noticed something strange, muddy footprints on my balcony. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Muddy, wet footprints leading from one side of the balcony to the other. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. How? My balcony door was locked from the inside, and there was no way anyone could have gotten up there without a ladder or something similar. The building was 3 stories tall, and the only way to reach the balcony from the outside was through the fire escape, which was on the other side of the building, hidden from view. I felt my chest tighten. The footprints weren't just a few smudges either. They were clear, fresh, and made a definite path across the balcony. Each step left a large, muddy imprint, like someone had walked across it in boots. It was too early for maintenance or anyone to be doing any work outside. I hadn't heard anything, no noise from outside, no one walking around the building. I stood there, frozen, looking at the muddy prints. My first thought was to call the landlord or someone, but I didn't know what to say. I hadn't even stepped outside yet to see if the rest of the balcony was intact. Maybe I was just overreacting. But as I approached the sliding door, I felt this uneasy feeling creep up my spine. My mind was racing. I had locked the door the night before. The last time I'd been out there was 2 nights ago, to water the plants. There was no reason for anyone to be on my balcony. I grabbed my phone, checked the time, and then took a deep breath. I was about to open the door when I noticed something else. There was a small, wet smear near the door frame, just a few inches from where the footprint started. It looked like someone had pressed their hand against the wall. The muddy print was smeared, like someone had used their hand to push the door open. But it didn't make sense. I didn't hear anything last night. The door had been locked. I hesitated, staring at the handprint. My heartbeat started to pick up. I didn't want to go outside. What if the person was still out there? Or worse, what if they had been watching me while I slept? I finally forced myself to open the door. As soon as I stepped outside, I looked down at the ground. The footprints were the same, muddy, but no signs of anything else out of the ordinary. I walked to the edge of the balcony, looking down. There was no ladder, no sign of anything or anyone that could have left the prints. Just the empty alley below, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I looked around the rest of the balcony, searching for anything that didn't belong. The plants were where I had left them, the small table and chair were untouched. But those footprints, they were the only thing that stood out. I took a step back inside, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the door again, making sure it was locked. It was. There was no way anyone could have entered without me hearing them, right? The rest of the day passed without incident. I didn't hear anything strange, and no one knocked on my door. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. I kept asking myself the same questions. How did they get there? Who was on my balcony? That night, I locked everything again, double-checked the door and the windows. I stayed up late, just watching TV, not really paying attention to anything, but not able to relax either. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up and did my usual routine. But when I walked into the kitchen and looked out the window again, my blood went cold. The footprints were still there. Only this time, there were more. I stepped closer to the window, looking down at the balcony. It was like the person had returned during the night. The footprints led all the way to the edge of the balcony, and this time, there were smudges, like someone had slid their hand across the railing. It was clear now that they had been there after I went to sleep. And the thing that made my stomach drop was this: the footprints now seemed to be coming from a different direction, like the person had walked up to the railing, then turned around and walked back. I was frozen. My mind was racing. I wasn't imagining this. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been on my balcony, and they had been there more than once. I did the only thing I could think of. I called my landlord. I explained the situation, and after a few minutes, she said she'd send someone over. When the maintenance guy showed up, I explained everything to him, and he just shrugged it off at first. Could be some kids messing around, he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that either. He took a quick look outside and muttered under his breath when he saw the prints. That's strange. He checked the door frame and around the balcony but found nothing unusual. He told me there were no cameras on the back of the building and that it would be hard to trace who was up there. I felt like he was brushing me off, like he didn't want to deal with it. I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my chest. I was afraid to go back to sleep that night. Afraid that whoever had been on my balcony would come back again. What if they were watching me? What if they were waiting for me to do something? I couldn't stay there another minute. I packed my things and moved out the next week. I told the landlord I was leaving, but I didn't explain why. I couldn't. I just couldn't shake the image of those muddy footprints, and I wasn't willing to wait around to find out who had been walking on my balcony. I just wanted to be somewhere safe. I never found out who it was. I never heard anything from the landlord again. I don't think she ever took it seriously. But to this day, every time I move into a new place, I check the balcony first. And I always make sure the door is locked. I had been babysitting for the Davis family for a few months. They were nice enough, had 2 kids, a boy, Ben, and a girl, Emma, and everything about the job seemed normal. They were always clear with their instructions, and I'd watched them come and go many times without any issues. They had this big, comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, and I usually spent my time there watching movies or reading while the kids slept. It was a Friday night, and the parents had gone out for a dinner party. The kids were in bed by 9:30, and I was just finishing up with the dishes when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, thinking it was one of my friends texting me, but when I looked at the screen, I saw something odd. It was a number I didn't recognize. The text read, "Don't let them open the door." I stared at the message for a moment. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know who this was, but something about the message felt urgent. It didn't make sense. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was some prank. But the tone of it made my stomach twist. I set the phone down on the counter, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. I went back to wiping the dishes, but my mind kept going back to the message. I kept glancing at my phone on the counter, wondering if they'd text again. I stood there, frozen, when I heard it. A knock on the door. It was loud enough to make me jump. At first, I thought it was the parents coming back early. But then I looked at the clock, and it wasn't even 10:30 yet. They weren't due back for another hour. I glanced at my phone again. No new messages. I walked slowly toward the door, my mind racing. Why would anyone be knocking at this hour? The lights were all on in the house. I had no idea who would be at the door. But then, I remembered the message, "Don't let them open the door." My heart started to race. The knocking came again. 3 loud, firm knocks. The sound felt so out of place. So unnatural. I stood there, my hand gripping the doorknob, unsure of what to do. I thought about calling the parents, but it felt silly. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Maybe it was some delivery person. But then I remembered the text. I couldn't shake it. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if someone had sent it for a reason? I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, just listening. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Another knock. This time it was more insistent, like whoever it was getting impatient. I stepped back from the door, suddenly unsure of myself. I looked out the window beside the door, trying to see who it was. The front porch was illuminated by a single light, but I couldn't make out anyone standing there. Just shadows. I hesitated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore the knocking, but I also didn't want to open the door. Something wasn't right. Something in my gut told me that if I opened it, I might regret it. I took a deep breath and decided to text the parents. Maybe they'd had some issue on their way back and were trying to get in touch. I typed out the message. "Hey, someone's at the door. Is everything okay?" I hit send, waited for a response. The seconds felt like hours. I glanced back at the door. The knocking had stopped, but I could still feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited a few more minutes, staring at my phone, but there was no reply from the parents. I texted again. "Please let me know if you're running late." Someone knocked, and I'm not sure who it is. Still no reply. My mind was racing now. I couldn't stop thinking about the message, "Don't let them open the door." But who was them? Who was knocking? Was I just overthinking it? Maybe it was nothing. I decided to call the parents. Maybe they would pick up. The phone rang a few times, and I almost felt relieved when they answered. But that relief didn't last long. "Hello?" The voice on the other end wasn't the parents, it was someone else. A man. "Ah, hi," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm babysitting the kids at the Davis house." "Who is this?" There was a long pause. Then the man spoke. His voice was calm, but there was something about it that felt wrong. "This is Officer Harris," he said. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Are you all right?" I felt my blood run cold. Suspicious activity? I stammered. "What do you mean?" "I'm just here with the kids. There was someone at the door just now, and I don't know who it was. I don't know if I should open it." He was silent for a moment. "You don't need to worry about that. Just stay inside, lock all the doors, and stay on the phone with me until help arrives." "I'll be there shortly." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, confused, trying to process what had just happened. Why had he hung up so quickly? Why hadn't he asked anything else? And why did it feel so off? I locked the door and grabbed the kids' phones, checking to make sure everything was secure. But as I was walking back toward the living room, I heard it again. A knock on the door. It wasn't a quick knock this time. It was slow, methodical, and it was coming from the back door. I froze. I didn't know who was knocking, but I didn't want to find out. I couldn't stay there. I called 911. By the time the police arrived, I had locked myself and the kids in the bedroom, sitting in silence. I didn't know who had been at the door or why they were there, but I wasn't taking any chances. The police found nothing outside when they checked. No footprints. No signs of anyone being there. The strangest part? I never got another message. Never heard from that officer again. I don't babysit for that family anymore. I don't feel safe in that neighborhood anymore. I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching us that night, and I'm not sure if it's over yet. I never liked trying on clothes in stores. It always felt awkward and uncomfortable, the fluorescent lights too bright, and the mirrors too large. But that day, I was out shopping for a few new things and figured I'd just bite the bullet and try on a couple of dresses. I went into the fitting room, which was tucked in the back corner of the store. There were a few other rooms lined up, and the only thing separating them from the store was a thin, worn-out curtain. I grabbed a couple of dresses and went into the last one, closing the curtain behind me. It was a typical, quiet afternoon. No one else was really in the fitting room area, so I was alone. As I took off my clothes to try on the first dress, I noticed something strange about the mirror. It was a long one, full length, just like the ones they usually put in fitting rooms. But at the bottom left corner of the mirror, there was a small hole. I squinted at it, confused. It didn't look like it was part of the design or a crack. It was too small to be a reflection of anything on the other side of the room. It was just a tiny hole in the glass, but it made my stomach churn a little. I thought maybe it was some weird flaw in the mirror, so I shrugged it off and put on the dress. But when I looked back at the mirror, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It wasn't the hole, but the way the room looked behind me. It was the same as before, but I had this creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, but the room was still empty. I felt stupid for letting my mind wander like that. So, I focused back on the dress, adjusting it in the mirror, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the hole. Maybe I was overthinking it. But every time I looked at that spot, I couldn't help but wonder if someone was watching me through it. I tried to distract myself by looking at the dress, but that feeling never really went away. After a few minutes, I decided I'd had enough. I wanted to find an employee, ask them about the hole in the mirror, maybe get their opinion on the dress, and just get out of there. I grabbed my things and opened the curtain, stepping out into the main fitting room area. I didn't expect to see anyone. But as soon as I walked out, I saw a man in the corner of my eye. He was wearing the store's security uniform. The thing that caught my attention wasn't that he was there, but that he seemed to be quickly walking away from the area where I had just been. He was holding something in his hand, but it wasn't clear what it was. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized what he was carrying, a camera. My heart skipped a beat. I watched him turn the corner of the fitting room area, his pace quickening, like he was trying to avoid being seen. I wasn't sure what he was doing, but the camera in his hand made me feel uneasy. It didn't make sense. Why was he carrying a camera, and why was he moving so quickly, trying to get out of view? I stood there for a second, frozen, my mind trying to make sense of what was going on. I thought about going after him, maybe asking if he worked here or if I could speak with him about the mirror. But something held me back. It felt wrong. Like something was off about the whole situation. I hesitated, then I made the decision to walk toward the employee area. I needed to talk to someone. I reached the counter, where one of the sales associates was standing, and I started explaining what had happened. I mentioned the hole in the mirror, how strange it felt, and how the security guard had walked away so quickly with a camera in hand. She looked at me, her expression blank at first, then slowly, her face shifted into one of concern. She didn't say anything at first. Then she stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. "You saw him with a camera?" she asked, almost whispering. I nodded. Yes. He had a camera in his hand. He was walking away quickly, like he didn't want anyone to see him. She glanced over her shoulder, checking the other side of the store. "That's odd," she said quietly. "I'll let you know if anything happens, but I wouldn't stay around here much longer." I felt my blood run cold. Her tone was so off, so quiet, as if she knew something but didn't want to say it. I couldn't understand what was going on. Why would the security guard be doing that? Why was the associate so nervous? "I'm just going to call the manager," she added quickly. "You should probably head out soon. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." I didn't need to be told twice. I walked quickly out of the store, my heart pounding in my chest. Something didn't add up. I didn't know what was going on, but everything about that moment felt wrong. The way the guard had been acting, the way the associate responded, there was something I wasn't being told. I didn't stop to ask any more questions. I left the mall and didn't go back. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I keep thinking about that hole in the mirror, the camera, and the way the security guard moved. I don't know what his intentions were or why the store employees were acting so strange, but I know I don't ever want to go back there. I still don't understand what was happening, but I trust my instincts, and they were screaming at me to get out of there. It's been a few months since that day, but every time I walk past a store with mirrors like that, I feel my stomach drop. It was one of those afternoons where I just wanted some peace. I had been stuck inside all week with work, and the park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. There was a bench by the duck pond I always liked. It was quiet, shaded, and far enough from the playground that I wouldn't be bothered by kids running around. I was sitting there, just watching the water ripple and the ducks glide around. A couple of them were bickering over a crust of bread someone had left behind. I remember thinking how simple their little lives were, and wishing for a second that mine felt that easy. I noticed him out of the corner of my eye before he said anything. A man, probably mid-40s, in jeans and a windbreaker that looked a bit too warm for the weather. He wasn't remarkable in any way. Average height, average build, short hair. If I passed him on the street, I wouldn't have thought twice. He was carrying one of those reusable coffee cups and had a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Nice day, huh?" he said as he walked up. I nodded. "Yeah, it's great." I expected him to keep moving, maybe head to one of the other benches, but instead, he gestured to the empty spot next to me. "Mind if I sit?" It felt rude to say no, so I scooted over a little, even though there was plenty of room. He sat down and set his coffee on the ground next to his feet. For a minute, he just stared out at the water, and I thought maybe that was the end of it. "You come here often?" he asked after a while. "Sometimes," I said. "It's a nice spot." He nodded, like he was agreeing, but then he turned to look at me. "I don't think I've seen you here before. You live around here?" The question caught me off guard. Something about the way he asked felt too direct, but I didn't want to be rude. "Yeah, not far," I said, keeping it vague. "Nice. This area's quiet. Safe. I live a couple blocks over myself," he said. "It's rare to see new faces. Most people stick to their routines, you know?" I didn't respond, hoping that would end the conversation, but he wasn't done. "So, what do you do for work?" he asked. The question made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd ask a stranger sitting in a park. I shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Nothing exciting," I said. "Just office stuff." "Office stuff, huh? Like accounting? IT?" "Something like that," he pressed, like he wasn't satisfied with my answer. I glanced at him, and he was watching me closely. I could feel my pulse pick up, but I tried to stay calm. "Just general admin stuff," I said. "Pretty boring." He nodded slowly, as if he was filing the information away. "Boring's not so bad," he said. "Better than stressful, right?" I didn't reply. I just wanted him to lose interest and leave, but he didn't. "You live alone?" he asked suddenly. That's when alarm bells started going off in my head. The question was too personal, too intrusive. I forced a small laugh, trying to deflect. "Why you ask?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just making conversation. You seem like someone who enjoys their space, that's all." I didn't like the way he was looking at me, like he was trying to read my thoughts. I stood up, pretending to check my phone. "Well, I should get going. Have a good day." As I turned to leave, he stood up too. "Hey, no need to rush off." "I didn't mean to bother you," he said. "I'm just a friendly guy." I forced a polite smile, even though my heart was racing. "It's fine. I just have somewhere to be." He stepped to the side, casually blocking the path. "You're sure? I feel bad if I made you uncomfortable." "That wasn't my intention." "You didn't," I lied, trying to sidestep him. He didn't move right away, but then he stepped back and gestured for me to go. "All right, well, maybe I'll see you around again." I walked away as calmly as I could, but as soon as I was out of sight, I picked up my pace. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the encounter. Was he just a lonely guy looking for conversation, or was there something more to it? The way he asked those questions, the way he watched me, it didn't feel right. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. When I reached the street, I stopped and looked back toward the pond. He was still there, standing by the bench, watching me. He didn't wave or say anything, but the fact that he was just standing there, not sitting, made my skin crawl. I hurried home, locking the door behind me as soon as I got inside. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I started double-checking my locks before bed and avoiding that park altogether. Maybe I was overreacting, but I didn't want to find out the hard way that I wasn't. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I checked into the hotel. It was a last-minute booking after a long day of travel, and honestly, I was just looking forward to getting some sleep. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours and my body was aching. So when I arrived at the hotel, I didn't really pay much attention to the details. I grabbed my room key and made my way up to the 3rd floor, expecting to just crash and forget about the world for a few hours. The room was pretty standard for a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a small desk, a TV that I wasn't going to use, and a bathroom that was far too small for my liking. But at that point, I didn't care. I was just glad to have a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, unpacked a few things, and threw myself on the bed. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I figured most of the other guests were already asleep. I set my alarm for an early start the next day, and I pulled the covers up, sinking into the warmth of the bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted, and the comfort of the hotel bed quickly lulled me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of my door unlocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by a soft click. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't ordered room service, and I hadn't told anyone I was in town, so why would someone be unlocking my door at this hour? I listened, straining to hear any sounds, but everything was eerily quiet. I told myself it was probably just the hotel staff. Maybe they were checking something, doing a routine check, or maybe it was a mistake. They could have been given the wrong room key by mistake. But that didn't explain why the door opened. I was too scared to move, but my curiosity pushed me to inch closer to the door. I could hear soft footsteps, almost hesitant. The door cracked open just a little more, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the hallway. Then the door opened all the way. A man stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He looked disoriented, like he'd just woken up himself. He was holding a room key, and he looked down at it, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I think there's been a mistake. I was given this room key at the front desk. I'm supposed to be in here." I sat up in bed, blinking in disbelief. "What?" The man took a step into the room. His clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been traveling or just got out of bed. His hair was messy, and he had that look on his face, the one people get when they don't quite know what's going on. I could see him glancing around the room, clearly confused. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "They must have given me the wrong key." I stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. My first instinct was to get up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, looking like he didn't belong, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong in the room. I should have said something, called the front desk, but the words didn't come out. "You're sure you're in the right room?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gotten confused. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he just made a mistake. But even as I asked, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the key in his hand. He looked over at me again, his face a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "They told me this was where I was supposed to be." There was an odd hesitation in his voice, something off. And yet, there was this genuine, almost apologetic tone in the way he spoke. Something felt wrong. I quickly glanced at the door, then back at the man. It all felt surreal. Why would he walk into a room at this hour, acting so casual about it? Why didn't he immediately apologize and leave when he realized his mistake? "Okay," I think you need to go back downstairs, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure what happened, but... Before I could finish, the man stepped further into the room, his presence blocking the doorway. He didn't push past me, but he didn't move either. He stood there, still holding the key, staring at me as if he was processing something. The more I looked at him, the more I realized how out of place he seemed. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. The room felt smaller now, almost like the walls were closing in. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that kept growing. My hand reached for my phone on the bedside table, but I was too slow. I'm really sorry, the man said again, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't mean to intrude. But this is my room, right? I swallowed hard. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. Something about the way he asked that question, it was like he didn't even care whether he was supposed to be there or not. I finally found my voice. No, it's not. I've been here all night. I'm the one staying here. I reached for my phone again, this time with more urgency. But the man took a step forward, and I froze. No, it's fine, he said quickly, his tone suddenly shifting. There was a forced calmness to his voice now, almost too calm. It's just a mistake. I'll go down and get it sorted out. I'm really sorry. But he didn't move. For a few seconds, we just stood there, eye to eye, in that silent space between us. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt deliberate. All right, I said, slowly, my voice shaky. I'm calling the front desk now. I held my phone up, but the man suddenly snapped out of his daze and backed away from me. His expression shifted again, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing how far he'd crossed the line. Yeah, of course, he mumbled, his voice quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure of himself anymore. I'll go get this fixed. And just like that, he turned, walking out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I waited a few moments, my heart still racing, before I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. The person on the other end answered quickly, sounding cheerful. Front desk, how can I help you? Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, there's been a mistake. Someone just walked into my room with a key. They said it was the same key I was given, but there's no way that's possible. Can you double-check the room assignments for me? There was a brief pause. Of course, the clerk replied, her voice suddenly more businesslike. Give me one moment. She came back to the phone, her tone much more serious now. I'm sorry, but according to our system, there's no record of anyone being assigned that room key tonight. Are you sure the person you spoke to was from the hotel? I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling. The man had seemed so convincing, so sure of himself. But now, after hearing that, the whole situation felt even stranger. Why had he been so confident that he belonged there? Why didn't he leave when I asked him to? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been awake. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to hear the door unlock. But I do know one thing now. I'll never look at hotels the same way again. Every time I close my hotel room door, I wonder who else might be on the other side. When I bought my house, I was excited but nervous. It was my first home, and I knew there'd be a lot to learn. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, quiet, mostly older folks, nothing that stood out in a bad way. It felt like a good place to start fresh. I had only been there a few days when my neighbor introduced himself. His name was Dan, He came over while I was trying to figure out how to use the lawnmower that the previous owners had left behind. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a weathered face and a permanent smile. He carried a wrench in one hand, as if he had been in the middle of fixing something when he decided to come over. "Looks like you're figuring things out," he said, nodding at the mower. "Those older models can be tricky." I explained that it was my first time owning a house and that I wasn't great with tools. He offered to take a look at the mower, and within a few minutes, he had it running. I was grateful and thanked him more than once. He waved it off, saying he was happy to help. Over the next few weeks, Dan came by every so often. At first, it was always under the pretense of helping with something, tightening a loose faucet, showing me how to patch a small hole in the fence. He seemed like the kind of neighbor you'd be lucky to have. But then he started coming over just to chat. I didn't mind at first. I figured he was lonely or just friendly. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent. I'd hear his voice calling out from the yard while I was inside, or I'd see him standing at the edge of my property, looking over like he was about to walk in. He'd make comments about how quiet my place was or how I hadn't put up curtains yet. One day, I came home from work and found him in my backyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he noticed my gutter was sagging and thought he'd check it out for me. I hadn't asked him to, and I didn't even realize it needed fixing. I thanked him but told him I'd take care of it. He didn't seem offended, but there was a pause, a moment where he just stared at me, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled again and said, "No problem." That was when I started feeling uneasy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I also didn't like the idea of someone coming into my yard without asking. I told myself he was just being helpful, maybe a little too eager. A week later, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was still early, barely light out. When I looked through the peephole, it was Dan. I didn't open the door right away. He was holding something, tools, I think, and when I asked what he needed, he said he noticed my porch light was flickering the night before and thought he'd fix it. I told him I was fine and that I'd handle it later. He stood there for a moment before walking away, but something about the way he moved felt wrong. Like he was annoyed but didn't want to show it. After that, I started locking everything. I had been lazy about it before since it felt like such a safe neighborhood, but now I made sure every window and door was secure before I went to bed. I even put a lock on the gate to my backyard. One night, I was in the living room when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound. I turned off the TV and listened. It was coming from the back door. My heart was pounding as I got up and walked over. When I looked through the small window, I saw the handle move, like someone was trying to open it. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, just staring at the door. Then I heard a voice, Dan's voice. He called my name, quiet at first, then louder. "I know you're in there. Just wanted to see if you needed help with anything." I didn't answer. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But then he stopped. The handle stopped moving, and I heard his footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. The next morning, I found a screwdriver lying on my back porch, right near the door. I wanted to confront him, but I was scared. What if he got angry? What if it made things worse? Instead, I started looking into security systems. I bought cameras and installed one on the front porch and another in the backyard. The cameras made me feel a little better, but not completely. I was still on edge, still jumping at every sound. Then, a few nights later, I saw him on the camera feed. He was standing at my back gate, testing the lock. When he realized it was locked, he looked straight into the camera. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just stared for what felt like forever before walking away. That was it for me. I called the police and told them everything. They came out and talked to him, but all he said was that he was trying to be helpful, that he didn't mean any harm. He promised to leave me alone, and for a while, he did. But I still see him sometimes. He stands at the edge of his property, watching me. He doesn't come over anymore, doesn't try to talk to me, but I can feel his eyes on me. I don't think he's forgotten. I don't think he ever will. It started on a Friday night. I just finished dinner at a small cafe downtown and was walking back to my car when someone brushed past me hard enough to knock my purse from my shoulder. I didn't think much of it at first, just someone in a hurry. But when I bent down to grab it, it wasn't there. The person who'd bumped me was already disappearing around the corner, and I realized they had it. My heart sank. My whole life was in that bag: wallet, keys, phone. I ran after them, but by the time I turned the corner, they were gone. I flagged down a nearby police officer and explained what had happened. He said they'd file a report but didn't sound optimistic about getting it back. I drove home feeling shaken. I canceled my credit cards, locked my phone remotely, and changed some passwords from my laptop. I thought that was the end of it. Annoying, yes, but manageable. I didn't even bother to tell my family. It wasn't worth the stress. The next morning, my mom called. Her voice was tight, like she'd been crying. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, and she sounded surprised. She said she'd gotten a text from me the night before saying I was in trouble and needed money. My stomach turned over. I hadn't sent anything like that. I checked my accounts immediately. Someone had managed to get into my email. There were drafts of messages I hadn't written and emails forwarded to addresses I didn't recognize. They'd sent messages to my friends and family asking for help, claiming I'd been in an accident and needed cash urgently. Some of them had even responded. I called the bank and froze everything, but it wasn't fast enough. A few transactions had already gone through online shopping, money transfers. I spent hours on the phone trying to clean up the mess. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I got a text from my sister. It was strange because she rarely messaged me so late. She asked if I was okay and said she was outside. Confused, I went to the window and looked out. Her car wasn't there. I texted her back, saying I was fine, and asked what she meant. She replied, "You just told me to come over. Said you needed me." I hadn't sent that. I checked my messages and found one I didn't remember typing, sent from my number to hers. My heart pounded as I stared at it. The wording didn't even sound like me. I stayed up the rest of the night, checking my locks over and over, convinced someone was watching me. I thought about calling the police, but what could they do? No one had broken in, and the texts didn't prove anything. The next morning, I went to the phone store to get my number changed. They told me my account had been accessed from another device, likely by someone who'd gotten into my carrier account using personal information from my wallet. They secured it, and I left with a new number. I hoped that would solve the problem. It didn't. By Monday, emails were coming in from places I hadn't been: confirmation of hotel reservations, online purchases, even a gym membership. Someone was pretending to be me. Worse, they were good at it. They'd use my social media to post updates, Things like feeling sick, taking a break from the world, so anyone who noticed the weird messages wouldn't question them. I went to the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They opened an investigation and advised me to monitor my accounts closely. They said it could be a case of identity theft, but something about it felt too personal for that. Whoever was doing this didn't just want my money, they wanted to take over my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It said, "You can't stop me." I froze. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to block the number, but I didn't. Instead, I replied, "Who's this?" The response came instantly, "You." I didn't sleep at all after that. I called the police in the morning and showed them the texts. They said they'd trace the number and see what they could find. They told me to keep my doors locked and not to go anywhere alone. That evening, I noticed my front door lock looked different. Scratched, like someone had tried to force it. I checked all the windows, and one of them was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I stayed at a friend's house that night. The next day, I got another text. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my house. My hands were in the sink, washing dishes. I hadn't even known anyone was there. The message said, "I'm always watching." That was the last straw. I went back to the police, and this time, they sent someone to my house. They found a camera hidden in my living room, a small, black device tucked between books on a shelf. I felt sick. I hadn't noticed it, hadn't even thought to look. The officers told me to pack a bag and stay somewhere else while they investigated. I left that afternoon and went to my parents' house. For the first time, I told them everything. The police eventually traced the texts to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station across town. The camera had no fingerprints, and the email trail led nowhere. Whoever it was, they'd been careful. Too careful. I haven't been back to my house since. I'm staying with my parents for now, trying to put my life back together. The texts have stopped, but I still feel like someone's watching me. I don't know if they'll ever find the person who did this, and I'm not sure I want to know who it was. It started as just another drive home from work. The kind of uneventful commute you don't even think about. I was merging onto the highway when a black SUV cut me off. I hit the brakes hard, my seatbelt digging into my chest, and I leaned on the horn without even thinking about it. I wasn't angry, really, just startled. The driver threw up a hand, like they were waving me off, and I thought that was the end of it. A couple of miles later, I noticed the SUV again. They were hanging in my blind spot, then speeding up to stay even with me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at them, but the windows were tinted too dark to see anything. I didn't think much of it until they swerved closer, like they were trying to nudge into my lane. I moved over into the right lane just to get away from them, but they followed, sticking right behind me this time. At that point, I started to feel uneasy. I checked the time, 6:30 p.m., and figured maybe they were just in a hurry to get somewhere, but my stomach was tight. I decided to ignore them and keep driving. If they were trying to mess with me, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But then they started following me off the highway. My exit wasn't busy, just a small turnoff that led into a residential area. I didn't think it was strange until I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them right there, just a car length behind me. There were no other cars around, no reason for them to be on my tail like that. I made a left at the light, and so did they. I made a right at the next street, and they stayed with me. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But then I took another left, this time into a random neighborhood I didn't even know, and they followed. I drove in circles for a while, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But no matter how many turns I made, they were there, close enough for me to see their headlights in my mirror. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, so did they. I decided to test it. At the next intersection, I pulled into a gas station and parked right in front of the convenience store, where it was bright and busy. The SUV passed by without stopping, and I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But then, not even 2 minutes later, they circled back and pulled into the lot, parking just a few spaces away. I couldn't see who was inside. The windows were still too dark. I stared at the car, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my lap, and I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know what to say. "Hey, I think someone's following me," sounded ridiculous. Instead, I got out and went into the store, my keys clutched tight in my hand. I lingered by the counter, pretending to browse the candy display while I kept an eye on the door. The SUV stayed parked outside. Nobody got out. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I took a long route back to my car, walking through the rows of pumps to avoid getting too close to the SUV. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I decided to head toward the main road, where it was busier. If they followed me again, at least there'd be witnesses. Sure enough, as soon as I pulled out, the SUV did too. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I merged into traffic, trying to act like I didn't notice them. That's when they started speeding up. I was doing 40 in a 35, and they were getting closer, their headlights bright in my rearview mirror. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but they matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. I switched lanes, hoping they'd pass, but instead, they swerved into the same lane and honked. It felt like my chest was caving in. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I'd done to make them so angry. Was it the horn? Was it because I cut them off earlier? I couldn't remember doing anything wrong. I spotted a police station up ahead and turned into the parking lot without thinking. The SUV slowed down but didn't follow me in. They rolled past, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a large figure, maybe a man, but I couldn't be sure. I stayed in the lot for a while, waiting for my nerves to settle. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, I didn't see the SUV anywhere. I decided to take a longer route home, just to be safe. I stuck to busy streets and well-lit areas, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds. I thought I'd lost them. I really did. But when I turned onto my street, there they were, parked a few houses down from mine. My stomach dropped. I drove past my house, not wanting them to know where I lived. Instead, I went around the block and parked in someone else's driveway, crouching low in my seat. The SUV idled for a minute before pulling away. I waited until I couldn't see their taillights anymore, then backed out and drove straight to a friend's house. I didn't go home that night. I didn't even tell my friend what happened. I just made up some excuse about needing company and stayed on their couch, staring at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I filed a report with the police. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or a clearer description of the driver. I started noticing SUVs everywhere after that, at intersections, in parking lots, parked along my route to work. Each time, my stomach would clench, and I have to remind myself that it probably wasn't them. I never saw the black SUV again after that, but I still think about it every time I get in my car. Every time I glance in the mirror and see headlights too close behind me. I still wonder who they were, what they wanted, and why they stopped following me when they did. I don't know if I'll ever get those answers. When I checked into the hotel, it was already late. I'd been driving all day, and all I wanted was to take a shower and sleep. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just one of those chain places off the highway, but it looked clean enough from the outside. The woman at the front desk was polite. She handed me my key card, smiled, and told me my room was on the 3rd floor. The elevator creaked a bit on the way up, but I didn't think much of it. When I got to my room, I slid the key card in, and the little green light blinked. I pushed the door open, but it stopped short, like something was blocking it. At first, I thought maybe the door was sticking where the latch hadn't fully disengaged. I gave it another push, harder this time, and it opened enough for me to see inside. There was a man standing in the middle of the room. I froze. He didn't look surprised to see me, and that was the first thing that set me on edge. He just stood there, calm, like he'd been expecting me. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't doing anything threatening, but the way he stared, it was cold, detached. "This is my room," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked a little. He didn't respond, just stood there, watching me. I glanced down the hallway, half expecting someone to jump out and say this was some kind of prank, but it was empty. "Did they give you the wrong room too?" I asked, trying again, even though I already knew something wasn't right. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then, finally, he spoke. "This room is occupied." I felt a chill run through me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, deliberate. Like he wasn't telling me, but warning me. "I just checked in," I said, stepping back into the hallway. There must be some kind of mistake. He didn't answer. I slowly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and headed straight back to the elevator. When I got back to the front desk, the woman looked up, surprised to see me. I told her there was someone in my room. At first, she seemed confused, but then she frowned and started typing on her computer. "That's not possible," she said after a moment. "Room 314 hasn't been checked out to anyone." I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, but she just looked back at me like she didn't believe me. "I'm telling you, there's a man in there," I said. "He said the room was occupied." She hesitated, then picked up the phone and called someone. I couldn't hear much of the conversation, but she kept glancing at me, her brow furrowed. When she hung up, she said she'd send someone up to check. She offered me a new room in the meantime, but I wasn't sure I even wanted to stay there anymore. A maintenance worker met me at the elevator a few minutes later. He had a key of his own and told me to stay in the hallway while he checked a room. I watched as he opened the door and stepped inside. He was in there for what felt like forever, and when he finally came back out, he looked at me, confused. "There's no one in there," he said. I didn't believe him. "I saw him," I insisted. He was standing right in the middle of the room. The worker just shrugged. Maybe he left before I got here. "Door's clear now, though." I didn't want to go back in, but the thought of leaving without my things, my suitcase, my laptop, kept me rooted there. The worker handed me my key card and left, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. No sign of a man, no sign anyone had been there. My suitcase was still where I'd left it by the door, untouched. The bed was made, the bathroom light was off, and nothing looked out of place. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and even dragged the desk chair in front of it, just in case. I didn't feel safe, but I didn't know what else to do. I tried to convince myself that maybe the worker was right, that the man had just slipped out while I was downstairs. But then I noticed something. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes. It was subtle, but definitely there. The hotel was non-smoking, and I hadn't smelled it when I first walked in. I checked the trash can, the bathroom, even under the bed, but there was nothing. No ashtray, no butt, nothing. I tried to shake it off and focus on getting ready for bed. I took the fastest shower of my life, keeping the bathroom door locked and the curtain half open so I could see out. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on, even though I knew it wouldn't really make a difference. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump, the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of the building settling, even my own breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a soft noise. It took me a second to realize what it was. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle was moving. My heart felt like it stopped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the chair scraped against the floor. Then I heard the lock click, and the door creaked open an inch before catching on the chain. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it. They just stood there, silent. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When the woman answered, I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room. She said she'd send security up immediately. I didn't move until I heard footsteps in the hallway and a man's voice calling out, asking if everything was okay. When I opened the door, there were 2 security guards standing there. I told them what happened, and they checked the hallway, but it was empty. The only thing they found was the chair, still sitting in the middle of the room. I checked out first thing in the morning. The woman at the desk apologized and said she didn't know how it could have happened. She offered me a refund, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I still don't know who that man was or how he got into the room. The door had been locked, and the only key card should have been mine in the hotel's. But I know what I saw, and I know someone tried to come back later that night. We had set up camp late that afternoon, just before the sun started to dip below the ridge. It was me, my brother Will, and 2 of our friends, Jake and Brian. We picked a spot near a small lake at the edge of the forest, a place we camped at before. It was quiet, peaceful. We liked it because it felt far from everything, even though the trailhead wasn't more than a 2-hour hike away. We spent the evening like we always did, joking around, cooking dinner over the fire, and talking about nothing in particular. It was cool but not too cold, and the sky was clear. You could see every star. After we ate, Brian pulled out a flask, and we passed it around while the fire crackled. It wasn't until sometime after 10 that Jake noticed the other fire. "Hey," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want to draw too much attention. "Was that there before?" We all looked where he was pointing. Across the lake, maybe 300 yards away, a faint orange glow flickered through the trees. It was definitely a fire. "No way," Will said. "I didn't see it earlier." "Me neither," I said. "I think I would have noticed." It was strange. The lake wasn't huge, but it was big enough that we'd have seen someone setting up camp on the other side. And it wasn't like it was a popular spot. In all the times we'd been there, we'd never run into anyone else. "Maybe someone showed up after dark," Brian said, though he didn't sound convinced. We sat there, staring at the fire. It didn't seem to be moving, like whoever had made it was just sitting there, not doing much of anything. "You think we should go check it out?" Jake asked. What, now? Will said. It's late. Let's just leave it. Whoever it is, they're not bothering us. That made sense, but it still didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off. Maybe it was the fact that we hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, or maybe it was just the way the fire seemed so still. We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. Every few minutes, one of us would glance across the lake, like we were expecting something to happen. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The fire across the lake was still burning as we put out our own and headed to our tents. I lay there in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest and wondering who was out there. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. I crawled out of my tent and stretched, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The others were still asleep, so I walked down to the lake to wash up. That's when I saw it. The fire across the lake was gone. Not just out, completely gone. There wasn't even any smoke rising from the spot where it had been. I stared at the empty shoreline, my stomach sinking. Hey! I called back toward camp. You guys need to see this. A few minutes later, they were all standing next to me, looking across the lake. That's weird, Jake said. It was definitely there last night, right? We all agreed. There was no way we'd imagined it. Maybe they packed up and left early, Brian suggested, though he didn't sound too sure. I want to see where it was, I said. Come on. We grabbed our stuff and walked around the edge of the lake. It took about 20 minutes to reach the spot where we'd seen the fire. As we got closer, I felt a growing sense of unease. When we reached it, my unease turned to dread. There was no sign of a campsite. No fire ring, no ashes, no footprints, nothing. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and it didn't look like anyone had been there at all. What the hell? Will said, his voice shaky. Maybe we got the spot wrong, Brian said, but he didn't sound convinced. This was it, I said. I'm sure of it. We stood there for a while, looking around, but there was nothing to find. Eventually, we gave up and headed back to our camp. When we got there, we stopped dead in our tracks. Our campsite was wrecked. Our tents were still there, but everything else, our backpacks, our cooking gear, even our boots, had been moved. It was all arranged in a circle around a small, burned-out fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. None of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the mess. Who the hell did this? Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around, my heart pounding. The woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. We need to get out of here, Will said. We scrambled to gather our things. Some of our stuff was wet from the dew, but we didn't care. We just wanted to leave. As we packed up, I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone watching us. We hiked back to the trailhead as fast as we could, not stopping to rest. The whole way, I felt like we were being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the words scratched into the driver's side door. Keep out. We didn't stick around to think about it. We just got in and drove. I don't know who was out there with us, or why they did what they did. All I know is that I'm never going back to that lake. The rain had been steady all day, but by the time we left my parents' house that evening, it had turned into a downpour. The kind of rain where even the I-beams don't cut through, and the sound of it on the roof makes it hard to think. We were late getting on the road, and I was in a hurry to get home. Emily, my wife, kept looking out the window, biting her lip every time the car splashed through a deep puddle. "You sure this is the fastest way?" she asked. "It's a shortcut," I said. "Shaves off 20 minutes, easy." We were in the middle of nowhere, cutting through the back roads to avoid the highway traffic. The GPS didn't even register the route. It was just one of those things I remembered from years back when I'd driven this way before. The road was narrow, flanked by thick trees on both sides, and with the rain, it felt like we were driving through a tunnel. Emily didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. I wished she had. The first sign of trouble was the water running across the road. It wasn't too deep at first, just enough to make me slow down. The rain made it hard to tell how much worse it was ahead. I told myself it was fine. The car could handle it. We kept going. A few miles in, the water got deeper. It was up to the tires now, and I could feel the car struggling. Emily was gripping the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. "Maybe we should turn around," she said. I didn't answer right away. Part of me didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake. Turning around meant admitting defeat, and besides, the thought of going back through all that water didn't seem any better. "We're almost through," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The road dipped suddenly, and that's when we hit a stretch of water that looked more like a river. I slammed on the brakes, but the car slid a little before stopping. The water was flowing fast, rippling and churning under the beams of the headlights. It wasn't just a puddle. It was a flood. Emily started to panic. "We can't drive through that," she said. "It's too deep." "I know," I said, trying to sound calm. "We'll turn around." I put the car in reverse, but the tires spun uselessly. The back end shifted slightly, and I realized with a sick feeling that the water was pulling us. It wasn't deep enough to submerge us, not yet, but it was enough to make the car unsteady. I tried again, pressing harder on the gas, but it was no use. "We're stuck," Emily said, her voice shaking. The rain kept pounding, and the water was rising. It was already lapping at the bottom of the doors. I turned off the engine, trying to think. We couldn't stay in the car, not with the water climbing. But getting out didn't seem like a great option either. The road was pitch black, and the trees on either side looked like walls. There was no way to tell how far we'd have to walk to find help, or if we'd even make it through the water. "Do you see any houses?" I asked, squinting through the rain. Emily shook her head. "I can't see anything." I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were too far out in the sticks. Emily tried hers too, but it was the same. No bars, no hope of calling for help. We were on our own. "Stay here," I said. "I'm going to check how deep it is." "No!" Emily grabbed my arm. "Don't get out. What if it's worse than it looks?" "We can't just sit here," I said. "If the water gets into the engine, we're screwed." She didn't let go right away, but eventually she nodded. I opened the door, and the cold hit me like a slap. The water rushed in immediately, soaking my shoes and socks. It was up to my shins already. I stepped out, testing the ground. The current was stronger than I expected, pushing against my legs as I waded forward. I kept one hand on the car, feeling my way. That's when I saw it, something moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but then it moved again. A shadow, slipping between the trunks. I froze. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. No answer. Just the sound of water and wind. I turned back toward the car, my heart pounding. "Emily, "Lock the doors," I said, climbing back in. My clothes were soaked, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "What is it?" she asked. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I saw someone." Her eyes widened, and she locked the doors without another word. We sat there, listening to the rain and the water sloshing against the car. Every so often, I thought I heard something else, something faint, like footsteps splashing through the water. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. "We can't stay here," Emily said finally. "The water's getting higher." She was right. It was up to the doors now, and the car felt like it was shifting slightly, the current pulling harder. I knew we had to move, but the thought of stepping out into that darkness, with whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen out there, made my stomach turn. Then we saw the light. It was faint at first, a small glow in the distance. At first, I thought it might be a car coming from the other direction, but it didn't move like headlights. It bobbed slightly, like someone was carrying it. A flashlight. "Hey!" I shouted, rolling down the window. "Over here." The light stopped for a moment, then started moving toward us. I felt a surge of relief. Help was coming. But as the figure got closer, something didn't feel right. The way they moved, slow and deliberate, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person in a long coat, the flashlight held low. When they reached the car, they didn't say anything. They just stood there, the beam of the flashlight aimed at the water. I rolled the window down further, leaning out. "Hey, can you help us? We're stuck." The figure tilted their head slightly, like they were studying me. Then, without a word, they reached into their coat. I didn't wait to see what they were pulling out. "Get down," I shouted to Emily, slamming the window shut and throwing the car into gear. The tires screamed against the wet road, but finally, they caught, and the car lurched backward out of the deeper water. The figure didn't chase us. They just stood there, the flashlight beam following us as we reversed. I didn't stop until we were back on higher ground, the water no longer pulling at the car. We didn't see anyone else for the rest of the drive. When we finally made it home, soaked and shaken, I couldn't stop thinking about the person in the coat. About what they might have been planning. About how close we'd come to finding out. We moved into our new house in early spring. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood you'd expect to find a house like ours in, but the price was right, and the house had everything we needed. The kids were excited, and my wife, Liz, was looking forward to making a fresh start after the chaos of the past year. We'd been through a lot, moving to a new town, settling into a new job, all that, but it felt like this could be a new chapter for us. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, and the kids quickly made friends with some of the other children in the area. Liz met a few of the local moms, and they were eager to have her over for coffee. It felt like the kind of place where people looked out for each other, which was exactly what we needed. But there was one neighbor, the one next door, who gave me a bad feeling from the start. His name was Doug. He lived alone, which I didn't think much of at first, but there was something unsettling about him. He always seemed to be watching us, even when we weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. The first time we met him, he just walked across the yard to introduce himself, but he stood there too long, staring at me and Liz with this strange smile. I chalked it up to being awkward, but it stuck with me. At first, it wasn't anything major. Just small things. He'd wave from his porch, but then stand there staring while we got the kids into the car. He'd be outside when I came home from work, as if he had been waiting for me to pull into the driveway. He'd strike up these long, drawn-out conversations about the weather, or the neighborhood, or whatever. I tried to be polite, but it was like he was trying too hard to insert himself into our lives. Liz started to notice it too. She'd mention how strange it was that Doug seemed to always be home whenever we were, like he was watching for when we come outside. She made a joke about it at first, but then she started to get uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. It wasn't until about a month into living there that the weirdness really started. One evening, Liz and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The kids were upstairs, and the house was quiet. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a shadow in the front yard. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but when I looked out the window, I saw Doug standing in his driveway, staring directly at our house. I thought it was odd, but maybe he was just taking a walk or something. I told Liz, and she didn't think much of it either. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I went outside to check the mail, and Doug came over. He didn't even wait for me to come up to him. He just started talking, asking about the house and how we liked it. I gave him short answers, but he kept going on, telling me things about the neighborhood, about the previous owners of the house, about how quiet it was here. But he wasn't looking at me when he spoke. His eyes were darting around, like he was checking for something or someone. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded along. Things took a darker turn the following week. Liz and I were getting ready to go out for a date night. We had hired a sitter, and everything was set. But when I went out to start the car, I noticed something strange. Doug's garage door was open, and his car was parked inside, but the lights in his house were off. The windows were completely dark. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned around to get into my car, I saw Doug standing in his driveway again, staring at me. I got this chill down my spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. He was looking at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. It was like he was watching, waiting. I rushed to the car, locked the doors, and started it up. I didn't say anything to Liz right away, but I felt the tension in the air as I drove out of the driveway. It was like Doug was waiting for something, like he had been anticipating my every move. I brushed it off as paranoia. We went out, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night when we came home, the house was quiet, but something felt off. Liz mentioned it first. "Did you leave the porch light on?" she asked. I hadn't. I checked, and sure enough, the light was on. I went outside to turn it off and noticed that the gate to our backyard was slightly open, even though we had locked it earlier. I had no idea how it had happened, but that was when I realized something wasn't right. Doug had been at the center of everything. I couldn't prove it, but the sense of being watched was growing stronger each day. Liz noticed things too. Small things, like her gardening tools being moved, or our front door slightly ajar when we were sure we'd locked it. I started checking the windows and doors every night before bed, but it felt like no matter how careful we were, someone was always a step ahead of us. It came to a head a week later. I was home alone one afternoon, working from my office. I got up to make coffee, and as I passed by the window, I saw Doug standing on the edge of his porch, staring at me through the window. I froze, but he didn't move. He just kept watching, as if waiting for me to notice him. I pulled the blinds down quickly and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called Liz, but she didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I didn't have to look to know it was him. I could feel it. My blood ran cold as I heard Doug's voice, muffled through the door. "You're home alone, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost playful. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a lamp, and I stood still, listening. The door handle rattled, and I could hear Doug's voice again. "I know you're there. I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, but all I could think was to get out of the house. I ran upstairs and grabbed the kids, told them to stay quiet and hide in the closet. I didn't know if Doug had any intention of harming us, but I wasn't going to risk finding out. I called the police, my hands shaking, and within minutes, I heard their sirens. When they arrived, Doug was gone. They searched the property and surrounding areas, but there was no sign of him. They told me there was nothing they could do unless we had concrete evidence of harassment or a threat, and without that, they couldn't press charges. We moved out within a week. I didn't feel safe anymore, and neither did Liz. I don't know what Doug wanted, but I couldn't stick around to find out. After we left, I found out from a neighbor that Doug had lived alone for years and had a history of bizarre behavior. Apparently, he didn't like new neighbors moving in. They said he'd been trying to get the house next door to ours for a long time. I'll never understand why he acted the way he did, but I'm just glad we got out. Every time I think back to that house, to Doug, I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something much worse. We decided to go hiking on a Friday. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just 4 of us, me, Danny, Claire, and Joel. The trail was tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. Joel picked it because it was supposed to have some amazing views, and we were all up for an adventure. We packed our gear, food, and tents, ready for 2 nights of camping. The first day was fine. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, with little clearings where we'd stop for water or a quick snack. We laughed, took pictures, and talked about how nice it was to be away from everything. Danny was the jokester of the group, always messing around and teasing Claire about her fear of bugs. By the time we made it to the first campsite, the sun was setting. We set up our tents, made a small fire, and ate while the sky turned dark. That night, as we sat around the fire, we thought we heard something in the woods. It was faint, like a twig snapping, but it made us all stop talking. Joel said it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, Danny was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots were gone, and so was his backpack. At first, we thought he'd just gone to use the bathroom or explore, but as the hours passed, we started to worry. Joel and I searched the area, calling his name, while Claire stayed by the camp in case he came back. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear left behind, nothing. By midday, Joel suggested we pack up and head back to the car. He said maybe Danny had gotten lost and somehow found his way back to the trailhead. Claire was panicking, saying we should call for help, but our phones didn't have any signal. We agreed to hike back, figuring we could alert someone once we were closer to town. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The trail felt different on the way back, like the trees had closed in. Joel noticed it too. He kept checking the map, muttering that it didn't make sense. The path seemed longer, or maybe we were just more on edge. Then we found the first clue. A water bottle, half full, sitting on the edge of the trail. It was Danny's. He had a specific brand he always carried. Claire picked it up and started crying, saying he must have come this way. But why would he leave it behind? Joel tried to stay calm, saying it could have fallen out of his bag. An hour later, we found his bandana tied to a low branch. That was when Joel started to get nervous. "This isn't right," he said. "He wouldn't just leave his stuff like this." We decided to keep moving, faster this time, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. Around dusk, we found his boot. Just one, lying in the middle of the path. The laces were still tied, but it was dirty, like it had been dragged through the mud. Claire broke down again, saying we needed to stop and wait for Danny. Joel and I argued with her, saying it was safer to keep going. We didn't want to be stuck out there another night. That was when we noticed something. The boot had marks on it, like it had been scratched or clawed at. But they weren't from an animal. They were too deliberate, too clean. Joel and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything to Claire. We just told her to keep moving. As the sun went down, we found more clues. A ripped strap from Danny's backpack, a trail of granola spilling across the dirt. Each piece felt like a breadcrumb, like someone was leading us somewhere. I started to hear things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned, the woods were empty. Joel was tense, his hand gripping the strap of his pack like he was ready to swing it at someone. We decided to stop for the night when it got too dark to see. Claire was a mess, whispering that something was wrong, that we should have stayed at the first campsite. Joel tried to reassure her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a shadow, darting between the trees. I nudged Joel, and he saw it too. We didn't wake Claire, not wanting to scare her more, but we stayed up, gripping sticks like they were weapons. The shadow didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just circled us, staying just out of reach. By dawn, we were ready to run. We packed up as quickly as we could, dragging Claire along as she sobbed. The trail was easier to follow in the daylight, but the woods felt wrong, like they were watching us. Then we found Danny's other boot. It was on the trail, facing us, like it had been placed there. Joel picked it up and froze. Inside was a piece of paper, folded tightly. He opened it, and his face went pale. I grabbed it from him and read the message. It was written in blocky, uneven letters. "You're next." That was it. We ran. We didn't care about staying quiet or conserving energy. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush when the trail twisted too much. I didn't look back, not even when I heard Claire scream. Joel stopped to help her up, but I kept going, yelling for them to hurry. We made it back to the car just as the sun was setting. The lot was empty, and Danny's car was still there, untouched. We piled into Joel's car and sped out of there, not saying a word until we hit the main road. We reported everything to the police, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Danny, no evidence on the trail. It was like he had vanished. They said it was probably an animal attack or that he'd gotten lost, but I know that's not true. Someone was out there, watching us, leading us, playing with us. And they're still out there. I still can't shake the memory of what happened. It's been months now, but every time I close my eyes, I can see it all over again. The pain, the terror, the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I'm not sure I'll ever get over it. It was just supposed to be a quick camping trip, something simple, just to get away from the noise of the city for a weekend. I've always enjoyed the solitude of the woods, so when I found a quiet spot, I knew it'd be perfect. No one else around for miles, just the sounds of nature and the comfort of my tent. I set up my camp near a small stream and spent the day walking around, familiarizing myself with the area. It was about the third day when I decided to go off trail, just to explore a little. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft underfoot, and it felt like the kind of place you could easily get lost in if you didn't know what you were doing. But I didn't mind. I wasn't going far, and I had a good sense of direction. My plan was simple: walk for a while, maybe find a nice spot for photos, and then head back. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. The underbrush started to thin out, and I could see the ground was uneven, almost like something had disturbed it recently. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals, maybe, or some weather erosion. But then, I stepped on something that didn't feel right underfoot. It was a rope, thin and tight, hidden beneath the leaves. Before I could process what was happening, the rope pulled, and I felt a sharp, brutal pain shoot up my leg. I screamed out and instinctively tried to pull away, but it was too late. The trap had already triggered. I looked down and saw that a thick metal clasp had closed around my ankle, the pressure unbearable, and I could feel something sharp digging into my skin. Blood was starting to drip, and I couldn't move. Panic flooded my chest, and I knew I had to get out of it, but my mind was racing. I looked around, but all I saw were trees, more trees. No one around. I tried to yank my foot free, but it was useless. The pain was almost too much to bear, and I could feel myself starting to lose control. What kind of trap was this? It wasn't a bear trap. The metal was thinner, more like something set for smaller animals, maybe a snare? But it was too heavy for something meant for an animal that small. And the fact that it was hidden so well made me think it wasn't just a hunting trap. I managed to calm myself enough to think, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. I wasn't going to just give up. I looked around, trying to find anything that could help me. The trap was tight, and there was no way to loosen it. But there had to be a way to get out. I realized that I needed to stay calm. The more I panicked, the more it would hurt. But the longer I stayed in that spot, the more dangerous it became. I knew I was alone out here, at least, I thought I was. The woods were vast, and I was a good distance from camp. The trap could have been set by anyone. But then it hit me. I wasn't just injured. I was alone. I had no way to get help. And there was no telling who had set the trap or if they were still nearby. I tested the trap again, trying to move my leg, but it was useless. The more I moved, the worse the pain became, and I could feel the blood pooling around my ankle. I was losing time. Whoever set this trap, they could be watching me right now. Or worse, they could be coming to finish what they started. I thought about the knife I had in my pack, just a few feet away. It wasn't the best tool for the job, but it was something. It was the only thing I had. I tried to reach for it, but every movement caused the trap to tighten even more. I gritted my teeth, determined not to give in to the pain. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to get the knife. It took what felt like hours, but finally, I managed to grab the knife from my bag. I knew it wouldn't cut the metal, but maybe I could use it to loosen the mechanism somehow. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I could think of. I struggled with it for what felt like forever, sweat pouring down my face, my breath shallow and erratic. Every second I wasted was another second closer to being completely helpless. Just as I thought I might pass out from the pain, I heard it. A snap of a twig behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to listen, but the forest was too quiet. I turned my head as much as I could, but I couldn't see anything. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find me. I had no way of defending myself, and I knew if they saw me, there would be no way I could run. I had to focus on getting out of this trap, but I couldn't help but feel that someone was watching me. That they were getting closer. The minutes felt like hours. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, twigs breaking, but I couldn't see anyone. I knew whoever it was wasn't too far off. They had to know I was here. The feeling of being hunted, trapped like an animal, was overwhelming. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, each thump a reminder of how vulnerable I was. Finally, with a desperate move, I managed to use the knife to pry the trap open just enough to slide my foot out. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to stand, even though I could barely feel my leg. I didn't care. I stumbled forward, dragging myself away from the trap, my vision swimming from the pain. I had to get back to camp. I didn't care how, but I had to make it. I stumbled back to the path, trying to get back to camp. My ankle was bleeding, my whole body aching from the strain, but I couldn't stop. The thought that someone could be following me, watching me, made it impossible to slow down. Every step felt like a lifetime, but I kept going. Eventually, I made it back to camp, but the relief was short-lived. There was still the sick feeling that someone had been watching me, and I wasn't sure I was safe yet. I don't know who set the trap, or if they were still out there, but I didn't stay another night to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could, ignoring the pain in my leg, and drove straight back to the nearest town. It's been weeks, but I still feel like someone's watching me when I'm alone in the woods. I haven't gone back, and I don't think I ever will. It was a little after midnight when I got to the gym. I had a long day at work, and I wanted to blow off some steam. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. There was one guy on a treadmill when I arrived, but he left after about 20 minutes. By then, it was just me. I liked the quiet. I didn't have to wait for machines, and I didn't have to deal with anyone taking up space by scrolling on their phone. The gym wasn't huge, just a single floor with a weight section in one corner and cardio machines in another. The locker rooms were in the back, and there was a staff desk near the entrance. I did my usual routine, some bench presses, a bit of time on the rowing machine, and a lot of focus on the free weights. I lost track of time, like I always do. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when I decided to wrap up. My arms were sore, and I figured I'd done enough for the night. When I grabbed my water bottle and towel, I noticed the place was eerily quiet. More than usual. I hadn't seen the staff member in a while, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they'd step out for a smoke or to grab something from the back office. I walked to the front door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. It was one of those heavy glass doors with a magnetic lock that needed a keycard to open. I assumed my keycard just hadn't scanned properly, so I swiped it again. The reader beeped, but the door stayed shut. I tried a few more times, each swipe followed by the same beep, but the lock didn't release. I looked around for the staff member, but the desk was empty. I knocked on the door in case they were outside. No one came. My phone was in my gym bag, so I pulled it out to call the number posted near the desk. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the system was down, and the staff had stepped out. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd wait a bit and they'd come back. I sat on one of the benches near the free weights and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, almost like I imagined it. A heavy breath, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere near the back of the gym. I froze, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the air conditioning. Then it came again. Louder this time. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark corner near the locker rooms. The lights in that area were dimmer than the rest of the gym, but I could just make out the shapes of the lockers and the doorway leading to the bathrooms. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. I told myself it was probably just the air vents or something falling over in the locker room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I took a few steps toward the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Is someone there?" I asked. This time, I heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty gym, coming from the direction of the locker rooms. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, looking for something to defend myself with. The best I could find was one of the metal dumbbells. I grabbed it, the cold weight steadying my shaking hands. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a staff member playing a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in and was messing with me. Or maybe it was something worse. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark corner. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low and quiet, almost a chuckle. It didn't sound right. There was no humor in it, just something wrong. I backed away, keeping the dumbbell raised in front of me. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cracking. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, and I told the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since I was in a more remote area of the city. I kept the operator on the line as I moved toward the front of the gym. I could still see the dark corner out of the corner of my eye, but whoever was there hadn't moved again. The operator told me to stay on the line and try to find a safe place to wait. The staff desk had a small storage cabinet underneath. I crouched down and wedged myself inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering updates to the operator. Then the footsteps started again. Slow and steady, moving closer to the front of the gym. I clutched the dumbbell tighter, my breath shallow and fast. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the sound of those steps. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look down and see me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They headed toward the glass doors. I peeked out from the cabinet, just enough to see a figure standing there. The light from the street lamps outside cast their shadow across the floor. They stood there for a moment, their back to me. Then they turned their heads slightly, like they were listening for something. I ducked back into the cabinet, squeezing my eyes shut. A loud bang echoed through the gym. I jumped, hitting my head on the top of the cabinet. It was the front door. The figure was slamming their shoulder against it, trying to break it open. I told the operator what was happening, my voice barely more than a whisper. They assured me the police were on their way. The banging stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the weight section. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. The figure froze, then bolted toward the back of the gym. I stayed in the cabinet until I heard the sound of voices calling out, telling me it was safe to come out. The police found no one in the gym. Whoever it was must have slipped out through an emergency exit before they arrived. They checked the security footage, but the cameras in the back corner had been tampered with. I haven't been back to that gym since. I canceled my membership the next day. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel that same icy fear, like they're still there, just waiting. It was supposed to be a simple, harmless adventure. A group of friends, bored with the usual weekend plans, decided to explore an abandoned construction site on the edge of town. We heard stories about it, mostly rumors, nothing solid about it being haunted or dangerous, but to us, it was just another place to check off our list of things to do. None of us thought anything serious would happen. We didn't expect to run into anyone, let alone someone who had been living there for who knows how long. The place had been deserted for years, no work being done on it. The concrete walls were half finished, the skeleton of the building rising up in jagged shapes where workers had clearly stopped. Broken windows, rusted metal, and piles of debris filled the area, making it feel like a ghost town. We thought it would be fun to just roam around, maybe snap some photos for the gram and see what was left behind. It was only supposed to be a quick trip. It was me, Chris, Danny, and Liam. We'd all been friends for a long time, and none of us had any qualms about sneaking into abandoned places. But this was different. We climbed over the gate at the edge of the site, which was easy enough since the lock was broken and the fence barely stood upright. The place felt off immediately, but none of us said anything. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the site, but we figured we'd be in and out before it got too dark. As we wandered deeper into the site, we joked and laughed. The silence was unsettling, though, in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't like other places we'd explored. There was something heavy in the air, like the kind of silence you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. It should have been a clue, but we didn't listen to our instincts. We were near the farthest corner of the site when we heard the noise. It was faint at first, just the sound of something dragging, like fabric scraping across concrete. I froze, turning to look at the others. Danny had already stopped, and Chris was squinting into the shadows, trying to see what it was. We didn't move at first. The sound came again, closer this time, and then we saw it. A figure stepped into view. It wasn't anyone we knew. He looked like he had just crawled out from one of the ruins. Dirty, ragged clothes, his face covered in a thick beard, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was dragging something behind him. No, not something, someone. A bag, or maybe a tarp, but it looked like it was full of something heavy. We all stood still, unsure of what to do. My heart was hammering in my chest. Danny was the first to speak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wavering, but she tried to sound confident. The man didn't answer at first. He just stared at us, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he was trying to figure us out. "You shouldn't be here," he finally said, his voice low, almost too calm. There was a strange edge to it, like he was on the verge of something. We didn't move. None of us knew how to react. Was he a squatter? Was he living here, hiding out from something or someone? The air felt thick now, heavy with tension. It was clear that he wasn't happy to see us. "I said you shouldn't be here," he repeated, stepping forward. His eyes didn't leave ours. His hand reached down toward the bag at his side, but he didn't pull anything out. He just kept staring at us like he was waiting for someone to make the first move. I wanted to say something, to explain that we were just exploring, that we meant no harm. But my mouth was dry. I couldn't find the words. It was like the atmosphere had thickened around us, and I was suddenly too scared to speak. Chris took a step back, looking at the rest of us. His face was pale, and I could see him searching for an escape route in his mind. I could feel it, too. It wasn't safe anymore. The man's eyes narrowed as he saw Chris move. "No one's leaving," he said. His voice was much colder now, much more serious. Before any of us could react, he moved quickly, too quickly. He grabbed Liam by the arm, pulling him toward him with terrifying strength. Liam yelled, stumbling as the man yanked him forward, his hand tightening around his wrist like a vice. "Let him go!" Danny shouted, but the man didn't flinch. He dragged Liam with him to the nearby wall, slamming him against it with enough force that I heard a thud echo through the air. Liam was gasping for breath, clearly shocked, but still fighting back. His hands were free now, but the man was still holding him by the collar, pressing him against the crumbling concrete. "You don't belong here," the man said again, his voice cold and final. It all happened so fast. My mind was racing. I wanted to help Liam, but I didn't know what to do. Danny was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. I could feel my body shaking, and I couldn't seem to move. The man let go of Liam's collar and pushed him back, shoving him away like he was nothing more than an annoyance. Liam stumbled but didn't fall. The man looked at all of us, sizing us up. He took a slow, deliberate step back, still watching us. His hand slowly came up to his mouth, as if he were considering something. For a moment, there was silence. Then, he spoke again, his voice almost casual this time. "Get out. Now!" Before I changed my mind. We didn't wait around. We didn't argue. Without another word, we all turned and ran, sprinting back the way we had come. My heart was racing, and I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps heavy on the concrete. We didn't look back. We made it to the edge of the site, where the gate was. I don't think any of us stopped to breathe until we were out of the fence and onto the road. We didn't even slow down until we were far away, standing by the side of the road, trying to catch our breath. When I finally looked at the others, I saw how pale they were. We all knew we had barely made it out of that place, and none of us were going back. The man hadn't chased us. He hadn't shouted anything after us, but I could still feel his eyes on my back. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were, but I don't want to find out. It wasn't just a coincidence. He didn't want us there, and he made it clear. I don't know if he was living there or just hiding out, but whatever it was not a place for anyone else. It's been over a year now, but sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Would he have let us go, or would he have done something worse? I'm glad I don't have to find out. I've been debating whether or not I should post this. It feels too weird to even talk about, but it's something that's been haunting me since it happened. I don't even know if I can make anyone understand just how strange and unsettling it was. But I have to get it off my chest. My boyfriend, Ben, and I were looking for a quiet weekend getaway. We've been dating for a little over a year, and we both needed a break from work. Something peaceful, somewhere remote, away from the noise of the city. We found this Airbnb listing in the middle of nowhere, an isolated cabin in a small rural town, with nothing around it but woods. Perfect for getting away from everything, or so we thought. The place looked charming in the photos, rustic and cozy, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and big windows. The host's profile was friendly enough, and the reviews were good, though there weren't many. The ones that were there seemed fine, nothing that stood out as unusual. So, we booked it. It was about a 4-hour drive, and we didn't mind the isolation. It felt like a perfect escape. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin sat by itself on a dirt road surrounded by dense trees, the kind of place you wouldn't want to be caught in after dark. But it looked charming, and the air smelled fresh. The first impression was good. The host, a man named Earl, greeted us. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with graying hair and a warm smile. He gave us a brief tour of the place, showing us the main living area, the kitchen, the bedroom, and a couple of other rooms. The cabin was small but nice, with just enough room for us to settle in and relax. Earl told us that if we needed anything, to just let him know, and that he'd leave us to enjoy the place. It was all very normal until he mentioned something about a crawl space. "Just be careful up there," he said, pointing to a small door in the ceiling of the hallway. "It's a little tight. I've kept it locked up for years. You don't need to worry about it." I didn't think much of it at the time. We were just looking forward to a quiet weekend, and the mention of a locked crawl space didn't seem all that strange. Earl left after showing us everything, and we were left to ourselves. That evening, we settled in. Ben and I had some drinks, cooked a simple dinner, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It was nice. We went to bed early, both of us glad to have a break. But around 3 a.m., I woke up for no particular reason. I didn't hear anything, but I just couldn't fall back to sleep. I tossed and turned for a while, then decided to go to the bathroom. When I walked down the hallway toward the bathroom, I saw just a small, faint light coming from the edge of the crawlspace door. It was cracked open, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. At first, I figured I had imagined it. Maybe I was just half asleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached it slowly, leaning in close. I could hear faint rustling, almost like something shifting inside. Maybe it was just an animal or the owl settling. But it was enough to make me hesitate. I didn't want to wake Ben up, but my curiosity won out. I reached up to open the door and peered inside. The crawl space was small, barely tall enough to crouch in. It was dark, but the dim light from the hallway cast just enough glow for me to make out the edges of the space. There was a small, dusty box in the far corner. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, climbed up onto the ladder, and opened it. The box was filled with photographs, old ones. I could tell they were from different decades, ranging from the 90s to maybe the early 2000s. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were just regular pictures, people standing in front of the cabin, smiling. But then I looked closer at the backs of the photos. Each photo had notes written on it in small, neat handwriting. Stayed here July 15th, 2003, nice couple. December 12th, 1998, great guests, quiet. The more I flipped through, the worse it got. There were newer photos, two people I didn't recognize, but they were all taken at the cabin, smiling in front of the porch, or by the fireplace, or sitting on the couch. But as I went through them, something started to feel off. The notes began to change. The writing got darker. Stayed here November 3rd, 2011, he was nervous the whole time. June 6th, 2005, she kept looking out the window all night. And then, I found one that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of a woman, smiling like the others, but the note on the back was chilling. She never came back. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. There were several more like that. People who never came back or left early without explanation. I don't know why I kept reading, but I did. I heard a sound behind me. It was soft, but I could tell it wasn't just the owls settling. I turned around, feeling that panic rise in my chest. There, standing in the hallway, was Earl. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he was staring at me without saying a word. "Earl?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" He didn't respond at first. He just walked toward me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence was deafening. "Those people," he finally said, his voice cold, "they didn't leave." "Not all of them." I didn't know what to say. I backed away from the crawl space, the box still in my hands. What are you talking about? Earl's face twisted in a way I'll never forget. He looked almost sad, like he was apologizing for something, but his eyes were calculating. You weren't supposed to find that. You should have stayed away. I could barely breathe. I took another step back, but he was already standing too close. I didn't know what he was capable of. You need to leave, he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. Now! I didn't wait for another second. I ran. I didn't even bother waking Ben. I grabbed my bag, slammed the front door open, and sprinted into the woods. I heard him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I never looked back. The next morning, I drove back home. Ben was confused when he woke up and saw I was gone, but I didn't tell him everything. I don't think he'd believe me if I did. But I can't shake what I found in that crawl space. The photos. The notes. Earl's face. The people who didn't leave. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I won't. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. I don't ever want to find out. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't stop thinking about it. It started off as an ordinary drive, just me on a quiet road, the kind that goes on forever with hardly any traffic. I'd been out for a few hours, taking the back roads through the countryside. My goal was just to clear my head, enjoy some solitude. The sun had started to set, casting everything in a dim golden light, and the road was empty. It was peaceful. But then I saw him. He was standing at the side of the road, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a person in trouble. Maybe their car had broken down or they needed directions. I was alone, and it was the kind of road where help could be a long time coming, so I thought I'd stop and see if he was okay. It wasn't until I was closer that I started to get a bad feeling. There was something off about the way he was standing, how rigid he seemed, like he was almost too still for someone who was supposedly in need. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to at least be cautious. As I got closer, the man didn't step forward, just stood there with his arms out, still waving, his face impossible to read. I could see his eyes now. Something about them, it wasn't panic or desperation, but more like calculation. The pit of my stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't a kid anymore, and it was probably fine. I stopped a few feet from him, rolled down the window, and asked, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and finally nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice a little rough. "I've been walking for miles. My truck broke down back there. I don't know what happened to it. Can you give me a lift to the gas station, just a few miles up the road?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I could see that his clothes were dirty, but there wasn't any sign of a breakdown, no car nearby, no tools. Just this guy, standing on the side of the road, looking like he'd been out there for hours. I wanted to drive off, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Are you sure it's not far?" I asked, my eyes scanning the trees along the road behind him. "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just up there. It's not far, I swear." I hesitated for a second longer, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From behind the trees, figures started to emerge. At first, I thought maybe they were other travelers, but then I saw the way they moved, purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't the casual walk of someone on a hike. It was controlled. That's when everything hit me. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't just random people. I don't know how I knew, but I could tell. I quickly rolled the window up halfway, keeping my hand on the door handle, just in case. The first figure that came out was a man, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Behind him, two more people, a woman and another man. They all looked off. Their clothes were mismatched, like they had been wearing whatever they could find. They weren't acting normal either. Their eyes were fixed on me, and they were moving with intent. The man who'd been standing by the road had stopped waving and was just staring at me now, a strange half-smile forming on his lips. I could feel my heart racing as my mind went into overdrive, calculating escape routes. I glanced behind me, trying to figure out if I could make a fast getaway. The road stretched out for miles, and I had no idea what was out there. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The man who'd been flagging me down took a step closer, his hand resting on the side of my car. "You know," he said, his tone changing, becoming smoother, more menacing, "we don't take kindly to people who don't help each other out around here." My throat tightened. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. But just as I was about to shift into drive, the man placed his hand on my side mirror and leaned down. "It'd be better if you just got out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No reason to make this hard." The others had closed the distance now. The woman was smiling, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The two men were standing off to the side, each of them looking ready to move at any moment. I froze, not knowing what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel before I sped off, throwing up a cloud of dust in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back once, seeing them all standing there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. It was only when I rounded a corner and they disappeared from view that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to my life itself. I didn't see them again, but I kept checking my mirrors the entire way, convinced they were somehow following me. I made it to the next town and found a small diner to stop at, where I called the police and explained everything. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but they said they'd look into it. They told me to be cautious, but the road was too quiet and remote for them to have much information. I don't know who they were, but I'm glad I drove away. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I haven't gone back on that road since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about those people, I just knew they weren't out there for a friendly chat. And I still wonder if I was the only one they'd ever tried it with. It was a normal Friday night. I had been in my dorm all day, catching up on assignments and half watching a movie in the background. Around 6, I posted a picture of my dinner, just some takeout from the cafeteria, and tagged the location. It wasn't something I thought twice about. Everyone does it, right? After that, I settled in to finish a paper that was due on Monday. My roommate was out for the weekend visiting family, so I had the place to myself. It was quiet, and I liked it that way. It was around 10 when I heard the knock on the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and people usually text before they come by. I got up, thinking it might be someone from my floor, but when I opened the door, I didn't recognize the person standing there. He was tall, maybe late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a jacket that looked a little too heavy for the mild weather. He smiled at me like he knew me, but I had no idea who he was. "Hey," he said. It's good to see you. It's been a while. I stared at him, confused. I'm sorry, do I know you? His smile faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. Yeah, we met at that thing last month. You probably don't remember. There were a lot of people there. I shook my head. I think you have the wrong person. No, he said, laughing a little. It's definitely you. You're my name, right? Hearing my name come out of his mouth made my stomach twist. I nodded slowly, trying to figure out if I was forgetting something. Maybe we had met somewhere, but he didn't look familiar at all. See, he said, like that proved his point. I knew it was you. Mind if I come in? It's a little cold out here. That's when the alarm bells started going off. I didn't know this guy, and something about him felt off. I kept the door halfway closed and said, I'm sorry, but I don't think I know you. Where did we meet again? His smile tightened. Like I said, at that thing last month. Look, it doesn't matter. I just thought I'd stop by since I was in the area. I glanced down the hallway. It was empty. Most people on my floor had gone out for the weekend, and the few who stayed were probably in their rooms with the doors closed. I was suddenly very aware of how quiet it was. I'm sorry, I said again. I think you might have the wrong person. His expression changed then. The friendly, casual demeanor slipped away, and he frowned, like he was annoyed. Come on, he said. Don't be like that. I came all the way here. I tightened my grip on the door, not opening it any further. I think you should leave. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to the door frame. You posted you were here, he said. Why would you do that if you didn't want people to know? My stomach dropped. That's when it clicked. The picture I posted earlier. I had tagged my location, my dorm building. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time, but now it felt like the stupidest thing I'd ever done. I'm going to call campus security, I said, trying to sound confident even though my voice was shaking. You need to leave. He smirked. You don't need to do that. I'm just trying to be friendly. You don't have to make this a big deal. It's already a big deal, I said. Leave. Now. He didn't move for a second, and I thought he might try to force his way in. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then he shrugged and stepped back, holding his hands up like he was giving up. Fine, he said. Whatever. I was just trying to be nice. I didn't respond. I closed the door and locked it as fast as I could, then stood there, listening. For a few seconds, I didn't hear anything, but then there was the sound of footsteps walking away. I peeked through the peephole and saw him heading down the hallway. I stayed by the door for a long time after that, listening and waiting. I didn't know if he was really gone or if he was just trying to make me think he was. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby. After what felt like forever, I called campus security. I told them what happened, and they sent someone to check the building. They didn't find him, but they said they'd keep an eye out. They also told me to report it to the police, which I did the next day. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about how easily he found me. All it took was one post, one stupid little tag, and he knew exactly where I was. I don't post my location anymore. I don't even post pictures until hours after I've left the place. I don't know what he wanted or what he would have done if I had let him in, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I keep thinking about how insistent he was, how he acted like he had a right to be there. It wasn't just creepy. It was terrifying.